They broke my crutches. Those 4 words fell out of Mason Carter's mouth like something shattering inside his chest, and the biker kneeling beside him on the wet pavement went completely still. 3 college students had just destroyed the only thing keeping this 20-year-old man on his feet, laughing while they did it, filming it for strangers to watch later. Not one person in that parking lot moved to help him, not one, except the stranger in the leather vest who was about to change everything. Before you see what happens next, hit subscribe, follow this story to the very end, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Mason Carter had learned a long time ago that pain came in 2 kinds. There was the kind that lived in his right leg, the deep ache that never fully left, no matter how many years passed since the accident. And there was the other kind, the kind that lived somewhere behind his ribs, the kind that showed up whenever he realized that people had decided without ever asking him exactly what he was capable of. That second kind of pain was always worse. On a gray autumn afternoon in Reno, Nevada, the wind cutting sideways across the parking lot of Whitmore Community College, Mason sat on the cracked sidewalk with his hands wrapped around 2 broken pieces of carbon fiber. His breath came out in short, shaking bursts. His palms were scraped raw from the fall, and all around him, students kept walking to their cars, some glancing down, most not bothering to look at all. He had learned to ride a crowd a long time ago. He knew the difference between people who didn't see him and people who saw him perfectly well and chose to look somewhere else. This was the second kind. This was always the second kind. "Get up," a voice said from somewhere behind him, thick with amusement. "Come on, man, it's not that deep." Mason didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He already knew the voice belonged to Tyler Briggs, the tallest of the 3, the one whose father owned half the car dealerships on the east side of town, the one who had never once in his life had to ask permission for anything. "Yeah," said a second voice, this one lazier, dumber, the voice of a boy who laughed because his friends laughed. That was Connor Wells. "Dude, we barely touched it." Mason looked down at the 2 halves of his crutch lying in a puddle of gray water. Barely touched it. The carbon fiber had taken almost 2 years of overtime shifts to afford. It had taken a specialist in Sacramento who understood how his hip rotated differently than most people's, who had built the grip angle to match the exact curve of his palm. It had taken him standing in a parking lot just like this one, sweating through a fitting session, refusing to let his mother pay for even $1 of it because he needed it to be his. Barely touched it. "Somebody get this on camera," said the third voice, and Mason's stomach dropped because this was the voice that scared him the most. Dylan Hart didn't laugh like the others. Dylan filmed. Dylan posted. Dylan was the reason 3 months of humiliation now lived permanently on the internet comments section. Open strangers weighing in on whether Mason Carter deserved what happened to him. "Guys, come on," Mason said, and hated how small his own voice sounded. Just give me a second." "A second for what?" Tyler said, stepping closer, his shadow falling across Mason's lap. "You gonna cry? Come on, cry for the camera. That'll get views." Somewhere behind them, a girl's voice, quiet, uncertain, said, "Guys, maybe we should..." "Should what?" Connor snapped, cutting her off. "He's fine, look at him. He's fine." Mason was not fine. He pressed his palm flat against the wet concrete and tried to push himself up, but without the crutches, his right leg simply would not hold his weight the way it needed to. His knee buckled. He caught himself against the low brick wall, bordering the sidewalk, breathing hard through his nose, absolutely refusing to let these 3 see his eyes fill up. "Somebody help me," he said under his breath. Not to the bullies, not to anyone in particular, just to the world, just in case the world happened to be listening. Nobody answered. Dozens of students had gathered by now. Phones half raised, the particular energy of a crowd that senses something is happening but hasn't decided whether it's their business. A few looked genuinely uncomfortable. One young man in a Whitmore hoodie took 2 steps forward, like he might intervene, then stopped when Tyler turned and looked at him. Just looked. That was enough. That was always enough. Mason had stopped expecting anyone to step in months ago. He remembered the first time it happened, a shove near the vending machines, his backpack knocked to the floor, 3 laughing faces standing over him while 40 people watched and did nothing. He remembered thinking, surely someone will say something. Surely this is the moment someone decides this isn't okay. Nobody had. And so Mason had built a wall inside himself, brick by brick, week by week. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he didn't need them. He told himself that surviving quietly was its own kind of victory. But sitting on that cold sidewalk, looking at the broken halves of the only thing that let him walk through the world like a whole person, the wall cracked. Just for a second, just long enough for something raw and furious and heartbroken to rise up in his throat. "Why do you even do this?" he said louder now, looking straight at Tyler for the first time. "What did I ever do to you?" Tyler's smile faltered just barely, just for a heartbeat before he covered it with a shrug. "Relax, it's just a joke, man." "It's not a joke to me." "That's kind of the point of a joke," Dylan said from behind the camera, and Connor laughed too loud, the sound bouncing off the brick walls of the science building. Mason looked down again at the crutches. At the clean snap in the shaft, the exact place his hand had rested, 1,000 times the place worn smooth from years of gripping it. In the dark, gripping it on ice, gripping it the day he walked across the stage to receive his high school diploma, when 3 separate doctors had told his mother he might never walk unassisted again. 2 seconds. That's all it had taken them. 2 seconds to destroy 2 years of work and 8 years of fighting. "Please," Mason said, and this time his voice cracked completely. "Please just help me up." Silence. A girl near the back of the crowd lowered her phone, her face going pale, like she was only now understanding what she was witnessing. But she didn't move either. Nobody moved. 40, maybe 50 people, and not a single hand reached out. That was the moment Mason Carter stopped waiting for someone to help him. He planted both palms on the wet concrete, gritted his teeth against the fire tearing through his hip, and began the slow, humiliating process of dragging himself toward the brick wall to pull himself upright without any support at all. Every inch cost him something. Sweat broke out across his forehead despite the cold. His shirt soaked through where it pressed against the pavement. "Bro, this is actually kinda sad," Connor said, and Mason heard the click of another phone camera opening. That was when the sound arrived. Low first, a distant rumble that most of the crowd mistook for a delivery truck on the main road. Then it grew deeper, rolling unmistakably the growl of something with far more power than any truck engine. Heads began turning. Tyler's smirk faded into something closer to confusion. The girl who had lowered her phone turned fully around, craning her neck toward the street. A single black Harley-Davidson pulled to a stop at the curb across from the parking lot. The rider killed the engine, and for one strange moment, the entire crowd went quiet, as though the silence of the motorcycle stopping was somehow louder than its engine running. A man swung his leg over the bike with the unhurried ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the specific way of a man who had spent decades doing physical work. His gray beard trimmed close, his hair pulled back beneath a bandana. A leather vest hung over his flannel shirt, patches sewn across the back and chest. Tattoos crawling up both forearms faded in places, the way old ink fades on skin that has seen 40 summers. He didn't rush. He walked toward the crowd with the calm, deliberate pace of a man who had never once in his life needed to prove he belonged somewhere. And the strange thing, the thing Mason would remember for the rest of his life, was that the crowd parted for him without being asked. Nobody told them to move. They simply did. Tyler straightened up by an instinct in him, recognizing a different kind of presence entering the space. Can we help you?" The biker didn't answer him. His eyes had already moved past Tyler, past Connor, past Dylan in his still recording phone, and landed on the young man struggling against a brick wall with 2 broken pieces of carbon fiber lying beside him. He crossed the parking lot in 6 long strides and lowered himself down onto one knee in front of Mason, ignoring the wet pavement soaking into his jeans. "Hey there, son." His voice was low, gravel rough, but gentle in a way that made something in Mason's chest ache. "You all right?" Mason stared at him, at the tattoos, at the patches on the vest that read "HELLS Angels" in bold stitched letters. He had heard stories about men like this his whole life, most of them not kind stories. He didn't know whether to be afraid or relieved, and for a moment he simply didn't answer. "What happened?" the man asked again. Softer this time, his eyes flicking briefly to the 3 students, still standing a few feet away, filming, suddenly very unsure what to do with their hands. Mason's throat closed up. He looked down at the broken halves of his crutches, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "They broke my crutches." 4 words. That was all it took. The biker's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle flickering beneath his beard. He didn't shout. He didn't lunge at the three students standing nearby with their phones still raised. He simply looked at Mason with an intensity that made the young man feel for the first time and longer than he could remember completely and entirely seen. "What's your name?" Mason Carter." "I'm Victor." He extended a broad, calloused hand, not to shake, but to help. "Victor Hayes. Some folks call me Stone. Let's get you up off this ground, all right?" Mason hesitated only a second before gripping the offered hand, and Victor lifted him with an ease that suggested he had done far heavier lifting than one injured 20-year-old. Behind them, Dylan lowered his phone for the first time in the entire encounter. "Yo, we didn't do anything, man. It was an accident." Victor turned his head, just slightly, just enough that all three boys felt the full weight of his attention land on them at once. "An accident." His voice stayed level, almost quiet, which somehow made it worse. "You stomped on a disabled man's crutches and filmed it. That the kind of accident you're used to." Tyler opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I know your father," Victor said, looking directly at Tyler now. "Briggs Motors over on East 4th. I bought parts there for 20 years. He let that hang in the air for a moment. "You think he'd be proud of what I just watched?" Tyler's face went through several colors in quick succession. "Look, man, it's not what it looked like." "I've got eyes," Victor said simply. "It's exactly what it looked like." The crowd, which had been silent, now buzzed with a different kind of energy. The energy of dozens of witnesses realizing all at once that what they had allowed to happen in front of them was now being named out loud by someone who refused to look away. Victor turned his back on the three boys entirely, an act that somehow felt more devastating than any threat could have. He crouched again next to Mason, gathering up the two broken halves of the crutch carefully, almost reverently, like a man handling something he understood the true value of. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you home." "You don't have to do that," Mason said quickly, an old reflex kicking in, the one that told him never to accept help. He hadn't earned and never to owe anyone anything. Never to be the burden people always assumed he already was. "I can call my mom, I know I don't have to." Victor met his eyes, steady, patient. "I'm doing it because I want to. There's a difference, son, and I think somewhere along the way somebody forgot to teach you that." Something about the way he said it, plain, unhurried, without a hint of pity, cracked something loose in Mason's chest. He felt his eyes burn and hated it. Hated that after months of refusing to cry in front of anyone, he was suddenly fighting back tears in front of a total stranger. "Nobody helped me," Mason said quietly, staring at the crowd still lingering nearby, at the faces that had watched everything and done nothing. Nobody even tried. Victor followed his gaze, taking in the dozens of students who were now suddenly very interested in their phones, their shoes, anything but Mason's face. "I know," Victor said. "I saw." He helped Mason toward the black pickup truck that had pulled in behind his motorcycle, driven, Mason would learn, by another rider named Ray, who'd followed Victor from a diner a few blocks away and eased him carefully into the passenger seat, setting the broken crutches gently across Mason's lap, like they were something worth protecting, even in ruin. As they pulled away from the curb, Mason looked back through the window at the parking lot, at Tyler and Connor and Dylan standing frozen near the brick wall, at the crowd of students who had watched an entire disabled young man get humiliated and had done absolutely nothing. He didn't feel angry anymore. He felt something stranger, something like the first crack of light breaking through a door that had been shut for a very long time. The ride to Mason's apartment complex was quiet at first. Victor didn't push for conversation, didn't fill the silence with meaningless small talk, the way people usually did around him. The awkward, overly cheerful tone people used when they didn't know how to talk to someone in a wheelchair or on crutches. Like volume and enthusiasm could somehow make up for the fact that they were secretly uncomfortable. Victor just drove, one hand loose on the wheel, glancing over every few minutes, like he was making sure Mason was still breathing okay. "How long?" Victor finally asked. "How long what?" "How long they've been doing that to you?" Mason stared out the window at the passing storefronts, weighing whether to lie the way he usually did. "Fine, it's fine, not a big deal." But something about the steadiness in Victor's voice made the truth come easier than it ever had before. "Since the beginning of the semester, almost 3 months." Victor's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. 3 months. It started small, comments, stuff online. Then it turned into, Mason gestured vaguely toward the crutches in his lap. That, you tell anybody campus security, your mom. Mason shook his head, staring down at his hands. What was I supposed to say? That three rich kids think it's funny to mess with the disabled guy nobody was going to do anything. People never do. I did something. Mason looked over at him, surprised by the simple certainty in the statement. Why, you don't even know me? Victor was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, something distant and heavy passing across his face. Because I had a little brother, he said finally. Kid named Danny, cerebral palsy, grew up watching people underestimate him his whole life. Teachers who talked to him slower, like his brain was broken instead of his legs. Kids at school who thought it was funny to trip him. Adults who looked right past him like he was invisible. He paused. I wasn't there enough. I was writing, working, living my own life, telling myself he had it handled. And by the time I understood how bad it really was for him, some of that damage, the kind that gets into a person's head, not just their body, it was already done. Mason didn't say anything. He didn't know what to say. Danny passed 6 years ago, Victor said quietly. Heart complications, nothing to do with any of that other stuff. But I think about him every single day. And I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever saw somebody getting treated the way people treated him, I wasn't going to be the guy standing on the sidelines anymore. The truck pulled to a stop outside a modest apartment complex on the edge of town, paint peeling slightly along the stairwell railings, a few kids' bikes chained near the entrance. Victor cut the engine but didn't move to get out right away. You didn't do anything wrong today, he said, turning to look at Mason directly. You hear me? Nothing. Those boys did something wrong. You just had the bad luck of being kind and patient with people who don't deserve either. Mason swallowed hard at blinking fast. Feels like I did something wrong. Feels like that every day. That's them talking, Victor said, not you. You got to learn the difference or it'll eat you alive. They sat there another moment before Victor finally opened his door and came around to help Mason out, careful and unhurried, the broken crutches tucked under one arm. The door to apartment 4B opened before they even reached it. Laura Carter stood in the frame in her scrubs, clearly just home from a shift. Her face shifting through confusion, then alarm, then something close to panic the moment she saw the state of her sun-soaked jeans, scraped palms, and a stranger carrying the shattered remains of the crutches she had watched him save 2 years to afford. Mason, her voice cracked. Mason, what happened? Who is this? Mom, it's okay. It is not okay. She rushed forward, taking his face in both hands, scanning him for injury with the practiced eyes of someone who had spent years working in patient care. Your hands are bleeding. What happened to your crutches? Mason opened his mouth, and for the first time in 3 months, the truth came pouring out. He told her everything. The comments that started his jokes. The videos posted online without his permission. The names. The laughter. The day someone had switched the elevator settings so he'd have to take the stairs and filmed him struggling up each one. The months of small cruelties that had built brick by brick until today, when 3 boys had finally destroyed the very thing that let him move through the world with any dignity at all. Laura listened, her hands trembling, her face growing paler with every sentence until finally she pressed both palms over her mouth and turned away for a moment, her shoulders shaking. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered when she could speak again. Mason, why would you carry this alone for 3 whole months? Because you already carry so much, Mason said quietly. The bills, the extra shifts. I didn't want to be one more thing you had to fight for. You are never, never a burden to me. Her voice broke completely now. You are my son. Do you understand that there is nothing more important to me than you? Victor stood quietly near the doorway, watching the exchange with an expression Mason couldn't quite read. Something between grief and recognition, like he was seeing echoes of a conversation he wished he'd had with someone a long time ago. Laura finally turned to him, wiping her eyes, seeming to notice him fully for the first time. I'm sorry, I don't even know your name. Thank you for bringing him home. Victor Hayes, ma'am. Are you the one who... I just happened to be riding by, Victor said simply. Anyone decent would have done the same. Nobody else did, Mason said quietly, and the room went still. Laura looked between her son and the stranger standing in her doorway, and something in her expression shifted. Gratitude, yes, but also a flicker of exhausted calculation, the look of a woman doing math she'd done 1,000 times before. Those crutches, she said slowly. They weren't cheap. I don't know how we're going to replace them right now. Not with everything else. She glanced at a stack of mail on the kitchen counter at bills Mason recognized, even from a distance, the particular pale blue envelope of the hospital billing department that never seemed to stop arriving no matter how much they paid down. We'll figure it out, Mason said quickly, an old instinct rising in him, the reflex to protect his mother from one more worry. I'll use the old ones, the loaner pair from the clinic. I can manage. Those hurt your wrists, Laura said. You told me yourself. I can manage, Mason repeated quieter this time, like saying it twice might make it true. Victor watched this exchange in silence, something working behind his eyes. Finally, he spoke. Can I say something? Both of them looked at him and, you don't have to figure this out alone. He said it plainly without drama, the way a man states a fact he's certain about. Either of you. I appreciate that, Laura said carefully, but we don't take charity, Mr. Hayes. We've never... It's not charity, Victor said. It's what people do for each other when they've got the means and somebody else doesn't. My mother used to say there's no shame in a hand up, only in refusing to offer one. He glanced at Mason. Give me 24 hours. Mason frowned. What does that mean? It means give me a day, Victor said. That's all I'm asking. 24 hours. You don't even know us, Mason said, echoing what he'd said in the truck. Why would you do that? Victor was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving between the mother and son standing in their small apartment doorway, the stack of bills on the counter, the broken crutches still cradled under his arm like something precious. Because somebody should have stopped for Danny, he said finally, his voice rough. And nobody did. I can't fix that. But I can make sure it doesn't happen again in front of me. Not while I've got breath in my lungs. Mason didn't know how to respond to that. Neither did Laura. The silence stretched heavy and strange until Victor cleared his throat and set the broken crutches gently against the wall near the door, like he was leaving behind a promise rather than a piece of wreckage. 24 hours, he said again. That's all I ask. He turned to leave and Mason found himself calling out before he could stop himself. Wait, Mason's voice cracked. Why does this matter to you so much? I'm nobody. I'm just some guy who got his crutches broken. This happens to people every day and nobody does anything. Victor turned back in the doorway, and for a moment his expression held something fierce, something that looked almost like anger. Though Mason understood instantly it wasn't directed at him. That's exactly the problem, Victor said. People telling themselves what happened to you is normal. It's not normal, son. It never should have been normal. Somebody decided a long time ago that folks like you and my brother should just accept being invisible, and I have spent my whole life refusing to accept that. So no, you're not nobody. You're the reason I got on this bike this morning, even though I didn't know it yet. With that, he stepped out into the hallway, the sound of his boots echoing down the stairwell, leaving Mason and his mother standing in stunned silence in the doorway of apartment 4B. Laura closed the door slowly and turned to her son, tears still glistening in her eyes. I don't know what just happened, she whispered, but I don't think our lives are going to look the same after today. Mason looked down at the broken crutches leaning against the wall, then out the window toward the parking lot where the black Harley-Davidson was pulling away into the gray afternoon light. He didn't know it yet, but Victor Hayes had already picked up his phone before he even reached the bottom of the stairwell. The first call went to a man named Marcus Preacher, Doyle Road captains of the local chapter, a broad-shouldered veteran with 25 years of riding behind him and a voice that could silence a room without ever rising above a conversational tone. Preacher, it's Stone. I need you to hear something. Go ahead. Victor told him everything: the parking lot, the broken crutches, the 4 words that had stopped him cold. He told him about Mason's mother standing in that small apartment doing math on bills she couldn't afford, about the old loaner crutches that hurt Mason's wrists, about 3 wealthy kids who thought disability made a person an acceptable target for entertainment. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. You know what this reminds me of, Preacher said finally. It wasn't a question. I know. You want me to make some calls? I want to do more than that. Victor's voice hardened. I want that kid to wake up tomorrow and understand all the way down to his bones that somebody sees him, that he's not invisible, that he's never going to be invisible again. Another pause. Then Preacher said something that would set the next 24 hours into motion. Give me a few hours. I'll make the calls. He kept his word. By 7 that evening, phones were lighting up across 3 counties. Mechanics closing up their shops for the night. Veterans sitting down to dinner with their families. Fathers who understood exactly what it meant to watch your child struggle against a world that refused to make room for them. Men and women who had spent decades being judged by strangers based on the leather they wore and the bikes they rode, never once being asked about the kindness that actually lived underneath. The messages spread simply without exaggeration, without embellishment. A 20-year-old disabled college student had his mobility crutches destroyed by bullies while an entire crowd watched and did nothing. His mother was drowning in medical bills. He needed help, and more than that, he needed to know that somebody in this world was willing to stand beside him. By 9 o'clock, the responses had climbed past 50 riders. By midnight, past 90. Somewhere in that small apartment on the edge of Reno, Mason Carter lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day over and over. The sound of his crutch snapping, the silence of the crowd, the low rumble of a motorcycle engine cutting through that silence, like something arriving exactly when it was needed most. He didn't believe Victor's promise. Not really. He had heard people promise things before, teachers, classmates, even a school counselor who once told him things would get better and then never followed up again. Promises from strangers rarely meant anything. He told himself not to get his hopes up. He told himself this was probably the last he'd ever see of the man called Stone. But some small, stubborn part of him, the same part that had spent 8 years refusing to let a highway accident define the rest of his life, couldn't quite let go of the way Victor had looked at him in that parking lot, like he mattered. Like what happened to him was not in fact normal, no matter how many people had trained him to believe otherwise. Down the hall, Laura sat at the kitchen table long after Mason had gone to bed, staring at the stack of unpaid bills, at the broken crutches still leaning against the wall by the door, at her phone, where she'd been quietly searching the cost of replacement carbon fiber mobility equipment and feeling her chest tighten with every number that appeared on the screen. She didn't know yet what Victor Hayes had set into motion. She didn't know that across the state of Nevada, motorcycles were being fueled, routes were being planned, and men who had spent their entire lives being misjudged by people who never bothered to look past their leather vests were preparing to ride at dawn. Not for violence, not for revenge, but for a 20-year-old stranger who had simply said 4 words that no one should have ever had to say alone. She didn't know that by morning, the number of riders would climb past 100. She only knew that for the first time in 3 months, when she finally turned off the kitchen light and walked down the hallway to check on her sleeping son. Something in the apartment felt different. Something felt like it was about to change. Mason woke before sunrise to the sound of his own breathing, sharp and uneven, like his body hadn't fully believed the day before was real. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the ceiling, half convinced he'd dreamed the whole thing, the parking lot, the sound of his crutch snapping, the biker with the gray beard kneeling beside him and asking, "What happened, son?" But when he turned his head, the loaner crutches were leaned against his dresser, the aluminum ones that dug into his wrists after 20 minutes, borrowed years ago from a clinic that never expected anyone to actually need them long term. He reached over and gripped one, testing the weight in his palm. Wrong, all wrong, too light where it should be solid, too rigid where it should flex. He set it back down and lay there another minute, listening to his mother moving quietly in the kitchen, the soft clink of a coffee mug, the particular silence of a woman who hadn't slept either. By the time he made it to the kitchen, Laura was already dressed for her shift. Dark circles under her eyes, a legal pad covered in numbers sitting next to her coffee. "You didn't sleep," Mason said. "Neither did you." She didn't look up from the pad. "I'm trying to figure out if we can move the electric bill to next month without a late fee." "Mom, I called the clinic already. The soonest they can even look at custom crutches is 3 weeks out, and that's just for the measuring appointment." She finally looked up, and the exhaustion on her face hit him harder than anything the bullies had done. 3 weeks, Mason. 3 weeks of you using those aluminum ones that tear your wrists apart. I'll manage." "Stop saying that." Her voice cracked sharper than he expected. "You keep saying you'll manage like managing is the goal. Managing isn't living, baby. You deserve more than managing." Mason didn't have an answer for that. He sat down across from her, reaching for the crutches, leaned against the table, testing his weight against them, already feeling the familiar bite against his palms. "Did that man call?" he asked. "Victor." "Not yet." Laura glanced at the clock. It's barely 6 in the morning. I don't know why I keep looking at my phone like he's going to text. You believed him. She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee mug slowly between her hands. I don't know what I believe. I've had a lot of people promise things over the years, Mason. Doctors, caseworkers, that lawyer after the accident who said he'd fight for us and then never called back. She shook her head. But there was something about the way that man looked at you, like he meant it. Mason thought about the 24 hours Victor had asked for. Less than half of that had passed. He told himself not to hope. Hope was expensive, and he'd learned a long time ago not to spend what he couldn't afford to lose. He forced down half a bowl of cereal, kissed his mother on the cheek, and made his way out to the bus stop on the borrowed crutches, each step sending a familiar ache shooting up through his forearms. He didn't know that 3 miles away, in a house with a circular driveway and 2 Mercedes parked outside, Tyler Briggs was having a very different kind of morning. Richard Briggs stood in his kitchen in a pressed shirt phone against his ear, his voice low and controlled in the way of a man used to fixing problems before they became public. I don't care how it looks, Tyler. I need you to tell me exactly what's on that video. Dad, it's not that big a deal. Your name is on the deed to 3 dealerships in this county. Richard's voice stayed even, but there was steel underneath it. Do you understand what happens to Briggs Motors if a video of my son bullying a disabled kid ends up on the news? Do you have any idea what that does to me? Tyler shifted in his chair, staring at his phone screen, where the video filmed by Dylan shared without permission to a group chat, and now sitting in the inboxes of at least a dozen classmates, sat like a bomb waiting to go off. It's already out there, Tyler admitted quietly. Some people already saw it. Richard was silent for a long moment. Get Dylan to delete it now, before this morning. He already sent it to people. Dad deleting it doesn't. I don't care what it does or doesn't do. I want it gone, and I want you to understand something. Richard's voice dropped lower, colder. If this becomes a problem, I will handle it. But you do not talk to anyone about this. Not reporters, not administrators, not that kid's family. You say nothing. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Richard hung up without saying goodbye, already dialing a second number, this one belonging to a lawyer he kept on retainer for exactly this kind of situation. 2 miles across town in the administrative wing of Whitmore Community College, Dean Patricia Voss sat behind her desk reviewing an email that had arrived at 5:47 that morning from a concerned parent, not Laura Carter, but the mother of the girl who had stood at the edge of the crowd the day before, the one who'd lowered her phone and gone pale. The email described what her daughter had witnessed. It used words like assault and negligence and liability. Dean Voss read it twice, then set it aside and rubbed her temples. By 9 o'clock, she had called campus security chief Frank Dolan into her office. What do we actually know happened yesterday, she asked. From what I gathered, 3 students destroyed another student's mobility equipment in the parking lot. There's apparently video. Apparently. I haven't seen it myself. Nobody's come forward with a copy. Dean Voss exhaled slowly. And the student who was injured? Mason Carter, sophomore, engineering track. Dolan flipped through a folder. No prior complaints on file. No incident reports filed by him at all, actually, despite what this parent email is claiming has been going on for months. So we have no documentation. Not from him, no. Dean Voss tapped her pen against the desk, weighing the political shape of the problem in front of her, the way administrators had learned to do for decades, not out of cruelty, but out of an instinct toward institutional self-preservation that often amounted to the same thing. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, she said finally. If there's no formal complaint and no confirmed video, we don't have grounds to take disciplinary action against 3 students based on secondhand parent emails. I'll have someone reach out to Mr. Carter to see if he wants to file something formally. Beyond that, let's not create a bigger story than what actually happened. Dolan hesitated. With respect, ma'am, if it did happen the way that email describes, if Dean Voss repeated, we deal in facts here, Frank, not secondhand accounts. Get me something solid and we'll act on it. It was, Dolan would think later, exactly the kind of answer that let a college avoid responsibility for as long as institutionally possible. Mason had no idea any of this was happening. He sat through his morning engineering lecture with his wrists throbbing. The loaner crutches leaned against the empty seat beside him, doing his best to ignore the whispers he could feel behind him. The video had already made its way through half the sophomore class, and though nobody said anything to his face, he could feel the weight of being looked at differently. Not with cruelty this time, with something almost worse, pity, and the particular discomfort of a crowd that knew it had failed to act and didn't know what to do with that knowledge now. During the break between classes, a girl he didn't recognize approached him near the stairwell, her voice hesitant. "Hey, you're Mason, right?" He braced himself. "Yeah. I'm Emily. I was there yesterday." She glanced down, twisting her hands together. "I'm the one who called my mom about it last night. I emailed the dean this morning. I should have said something in the moment. I know that I just—" Her voice wavered. "I froze. I'm so sorry I froze." Mason studied her for a moment, surprised by the rawness in her voice. "You're the only person who said sorry. That doesn't make it okay." "No," Mason agreed quietly, "but it's more than anybody else has said." Emily hesitated again. "Did the school actually do anything? I heard they're saying there's no video." Mason's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, no video?" "I heard Dylan deleted it off his account this morning. But people already have copies. I have a copy, actually. My roommate sent it to me before he took it down." Mason felt something tighten in his chest, a strange mix of vindication and dread. "Can you send it to me?" "Already did. Check your phone." He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and found the video waiting in his messages. He didn't watch it. He couldn't, not yet, not in the middle of a crowded stairwell. But he saved it, and for the first time since the day before, he felt something other than helplessness settle into his chest. Proof. He finally had proof. He didn't know yet that having proof and having power were not always the same thing, that somewhere across town a man with 2 Mercedes and a retained lawyer was already working to make sure that proof never mattered at all. That afternoon, Laura's shift at the assisted living facility was interrupted by a phone call. She almost didn't answer the caller ID showing an unfamiliar 775 number. "Is this Laura Carter?" "Yes, who's calling?" "My name is Richard Briggs. I believe our sons attend the same college." Laura's stomach turned to ice. She stepped into an empty supply closet, pressing the phone tighter against her ear. "I know who you are, Mr. Briggs." "I wanted to reach out personally," Richard said, his voice smooth, almost warm. The voice of a man who had spent 30 years learning how to sound reasonable while getting exactly what he wanted. "I understand there was some kind of incident yesterday between our boys. I want you to know how seriously I take that." "Some kind of incident," Laura repeated slowly. "Your son and his friends destroyed my son's crutches. He can barely walk today. And that's exactly why I'm calling. I'd like to make this right." A brief pause. "I'd like to cover the cost of new equipment for Mason. Whatever he needs. I'll write the check today." For half a second, Laura felt something like relief loosen in her chest, the exhausted, desperate relief of a woman who had spent the entire night doing math that never balanced. But something in his tone made the relief curdle almost as quickly as it arrived. "That's very generous," she said carefully. "What would you need from us in return?" A pause, just slightly too long. "Nothing formal. I just ask that we handle this privately between families, rather than dragging it through the school's disciplinary process or, God forbid, the news. Boys make mistakes, Mrs. Carter. I don't think Tyler's entire future needs to be defined by one afternoon of poor judgment." There it was. Laura closed her eyes, gripping the phone hard enough that her knuckles went white. "Your son filmed my disabled child crying on the ground and laughed while he did it, Mr. Briggs. That's not one poor decision. That's the ending of 3 months of torment. I understand you're upset. You don't understand anything." Laura's voice shook, but she didn't back down. "You're not calling because you care about my son's well-being. You're calling because you're afraid of what happens to your business if this gets out. And I would rather struggle for the rest of my life paying off medical bills than take a single dollar that's meant to buy my silence." The warmth drained instantly from Richard's voice. "I'd think carefully before you say things like that, Mrs. Carter. Accusations can go both ways. My lawyer tells me there are quite a few ways this could be framed: a physical altercation with unclear origins, an aggressive biker gang intimidating minors on a college campus. I'd hate for your son's name to end up connected to something like that." Laura went very still. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm simply saying that everyone has more to lose than they think in situations like this." His voice smoothed back over, deceptively gentle. "Think about it. The offer stands until tomorrow morning. The line went dead. Laura stood alone in the supply closet for a long moment, her hands trembling, before she slid down against the shelving unit and let herself cry for exactly 90 seconds. The only 90 seconds she would allow herself that entire day, before wiping her face, straightening her scrubs, and walking back out onto the floor to finish her shift, because that was what she had always done. That was the only thing she knew how to do. She didn't call Mason to tell him. Not yet. She didn't want to hand him one more thing to carry. But she did call one other number, the one still saved in her phone from the day before under the name Victor Hayes. He picked up on the second ring. "Mrs. Carter, everything all right?" "I need to tell you something," Laura said, her voice unsteady. "And I don't know if it's my place to be telling you at all, but I don't know who else to call." She relayed the entire conversation word for word, and as best she could remember, the offer, the check, the veiled threat about lawyers and biker gangs, and Mason's name being dragged through something ugly. By the time she finished, Victor had gone completely silent on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a coldness she hadn't heard from him before. "He tried to buy your silence." "That's what it felt like, yes." "And then he threatened you when you said no." Laura swallowed hard. "Yes." Victor was quiet for another moment. When he spoke again, his voice had leveled back out, but there was steel underneath the calm. Now the kind of steel that made Laura understand more clearly than she had the day before exactly what kind of man had walked into their lives. "Mrs. Carter, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not going to lose anything for telling the truth. Not while I'm standing anywhere near this. You hear me?" "I hear you, Bar," Laura whispered. "I just don't know how much that's worth against a man with lawyers." "It's worth more than you think," Victor said. "Give me till tomorrow morning. That's all I'm asking. One more day." After he hung up, Victor sat in the small office above the chapter's garage for a long time, staring at the framed photograph on the wall of a younger version of himself, standing beside a boy in a wheelchair. Both of them grinning at the camera outside a hospital that neither of them had wanted to be visiting that day. Danny had been 11 in that photograph. Some kid at his school had spent months calling him useless, mocking the way he talked, tipping his chair over in the cafeteria for laughs, while a room full of adults watched and did nothing, the same way a parking lot full of college students had done nothing the day before. Victor had been 23 then, deep into his first year of riding, telling himself he'd deal with it when he got back from his run through Colorado. By the time he got back, Danny had stopped telling anyone what was happening at school at all. He'd learned the way Mason had learned that silence was safer than hoping someone would help. Victor picked up his phone and called Preacher. "We need to move faster than I thought," he said. "There's a man named Richard Briggs trying to buy this family's silence and threatening them when it doesn't work. Owns 3 car dealerships. His son's one of the 3 who broke that boy's crutches. You want me to look into him? I want everyone to know exactly what we're riding for tomorrow. Not just a kid who got hurt. A family being threatened into silence by somebody with more money than decency. How many we got so far?" Victor checked the growing thread of confirmations on his phone. 106 last I counted. "By morning we'll break 130 easy," Preacher said. "There's a chapter out of Sparks wanting in. Couple riders from Carson City too, heard about it through Doc's network. Doc's coming. Says wouldn't miss it, says she's bringing supplies. Doc real name, Angela Reyes, a retired combat medic who now ran a small mobility equipment supply business out of her garage fitting veterans and civilians alike. With prosthetics and adaptive devices at cost, had been riding with the chapter for 9 years, ever since her own son came home from overseas, missing part of his leg. And she'd discovered the hard way exactly how broken the system was for people who needed more than sympathy. Victor felt something ease slightly in his chest, the first real relief he'd felt all day. "Tell her I need to talk to her tonight. About equipment." "Already figured you would." Meanwhile, 3 miles from the Briggs residence, Mason sat on the edge of his bed that evening, staring at the video Emily had sent him, finally working up the courage to press play. He watched himself fall. He watched the crutch snap under Connor's boot. He watched Tyler's laughing face fill the frame, heard Dylan's voice behind the camera, saying, "Somebody get this on camera." And he watched, this was the part that hurt. Worst, he watched the crowd of students standing perfectly still, phones half raised, nobody moving, nobody speaking for nearly 90 full seconds before the video ended. 90 seconds. He had counted every one of them in real time the day before, and somehow watching it now from the outside made it feel even longer. He set the phone down and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "You okay?" Laura's voice came from the doorway. She hadn't told him yet about Richard Briggs. She was still deciding whether she had the strength to. "I keep thinking maybe I made it worse than it was," Mason admitted quietly. "Like maybe I'm being dramatic. But then I watch it and it's worse than I remembered." "Nobody moved, Mom." 90 seconds and nobody moved. Laura crossed the room and sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "That's not on you." "Doesn't feel that way." "I know." She pressed a kiss to the top of his head, the way she used to when he was small before hospitals and accidents, and years of proving himself had hardened something in both of them. "But I need you to hear me, Mason. None of this, not 1 second of it, is your fault. You didn't do anything except exist in a body some people decided wasn't worth respecting. That's their failure, not yours." Mason was quiet for a long moment. "Do you think Victor's really going to do something? Or was that just, I don't know, a nice thing to say in the moment?" Laura thought about the phone call from Richard Briggs, the threat buried inside the offer, and the steel that had entered Victor's voice when she told him about it. "I think," she said carefully, "that man is not the kind of person who says things he doesn't mean." She still hadn't told him about the threat. She would not that night. She wanted him to sleep at least one more night without carrying the weight of knowing a stranger with lawyers wanted to make his suffering disappear for the price of a check. But sleep didn't come easy for Mason, regardless. He lay awake long after his mother turned off the hallway light, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, through the wall, replaying Emily's words in the stairwell. "I'm so sorry I froze," and Victor's words in the parking lot, "You're not nobody." And somewhere underneath all of it, a small, persistent question he couldn't shake. What if tomorrow came and nothing changed at all? He had been disappointed by hope before. He knew exactly how much it cost when it didn't pay off. Across town, that same question was being answered in a garage that smelled of motor oil and coffee, where over 100 confirmed riders had become 130 by 10 that night, each name added to a growing list that Preacher kept updated on a whiteboard nailed to the wall. Doc arrived a little after 9, her own bike parked beside a dozen others already lined up outside a duffel bag slung over one shoulder that she set down on the workbench with a heavy clank. "Talk to me," she said to Victor, pulling out a notepad. "What's the kid's build height weight injury type?" "Right leg damage from a highway accident when he was 14. Hip rotations affected. That's why his old crutches were custom fit angled grip. Something about how his palm sits different than most people's." Doc nodded, jotting notes. "Carbon fiber forearm platform crutches probably. I can get a custom set built by morning if I call in a favor with my supplier in Sacramento, but it's going to cost $1,200–1,300, maybe more, depending on the exact specs." "I'll cover it if I should cover it," Victor said immediately. "You sure that's not small money?" "I got a pension and no kids of my own to spend it on," Victor said. "Can't think of a better use for it than this." Doc studied him for a long moment, something knowing in her expression. "This is about Danny, isn't it?" Victor didn't answer right away. "Every damn day of my life." Doc reached out and squeezed his shoulder, once firm and brief, the way people who'd spent years around loss learned to comfort each other without needing many words for it. "I'll make the calls tonight," she said. "We'll have something in his hands by tomorrow morning if I have to drive to Sacramento myself and pick it up." By 11 that night, the garage had turned into something between a war room and a family gathering. Riders who had never met Mason Carter sat around folding tables, some contributing cash toward equipment, others simply listening, as Victor explained again and again to each new arrival exactly what had happened in that parking lot and exactly why it mattered. A rider named Tank, 6'6", built like the vehicles he restored for a living, sat quietly through the story, arms crossed, jaw tight. "My daughter's in a chair," he said when Victor finished. "Spina bifida, 6 years old." He looked up, his eyes hard. "You know how many times I've had to watch some kid at the playground all mock the way she moves? How many times some parents looked at her like she doesn't belong there?" He shook his head slowly. "I'm riding tomorrow. Wouldn't miss it if my own bike broke down, I'd walk." One by one, stories like his moved around the garage, a rider whose brother had lost both legs overseas and came home to a country that gave him a medal and then made him fight for a wheelchair ramp at his own apartment. A woman named Sandra, whose mother had spent the last decade of her life in a nursing home, being talked over by staff who assumed her dementia meant she couldn't hear the way they mocked her. Every person in that garage carried some version of the same wound, watching someone they loved be treated as less than human and feeling powerless to stop it in the moment it was happening. A younger rider named Cole, barely 25 himself, spoke up last, his voice quieter than the others. I used to stutter bad as a kid. Kids used to time how long it took me to get a sentence out, laugh, keep count on their fingers. He shrugged, almost embarrassed by how small it sounded next to spina bifida and lost limbs and a brother who died too young. Nobody broke anything of mine, but I remember exactly what it feels like to sit there and realize the room's decided you're something to laugh at instead of somebody to help. I'm riding tomorrow too. Victor looked around the garage at all of them, the mechanics, the veterans, the parents, the ones who'd buried people, and the ones still learning how much a small cruelty could cost a person for years afterward, and felt something settle deep in his chest, steady and certain. Tomorrow, none of them intended to feel powerless again. Around midnight, Victor climbed back onto his bike and rode to the Carter apartment complex, parking quietly across the street. The windows of apartment 4B dark except for a faint blue glow he recognized as a phone screen. Mason still awake, still scrolling through something he probably shouldn't be looking at this late. Victor didn't go up. He didn't want to intrude on whatever fragile peace the family had managed to find for the night. He just sat there for a few minutes, engine off, looking up at that window, thinking about Danny, thinking about all the nights he told himself he'd deal with it later, thinking about how later had run out before he ever got the chance. Not this time, he thought. Not while I'm still breathing. He was about to start the engine and head home when his phone buzzed. A text from Preacher. You're not going to believe this. Check your email. Victor opened it. It was a message from Emily's mother, the parent who had first emailed Dean Voss that morning, now writing directly to the chapter's public contact page, which someone had apparently found and shared throughout the growing group of writers. Attached to the email was the video, the one Dylan had tried to delete, the one that now existed in dozens of copies across a dozen phones uploaded by a mother who had decided after hearing what her daughter witnessed that silence was no longer an option. Victor watched it in full for the first time, 90 seconds of a young man being humiliated while a crowd did nothing. He watched Tyler's laughing face. He watched the crutch snap. He watched Mason fall. His hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles went white. He didn't sleep much that night either. At 6 the next morning, Richard Briggs sat at his kitchen table drinking coffee, checking his phone, expecting, though he wouldn't have admitted this to anyone, a message from Laura Carter accepting his offer before it expired. Instead, he found something else entirely. 3 missed calls from unknown numbers and a text from a colleague at the dealership that made his stomach drop. Have you seen this video going around? It's got your son in it. It's spreading fast. Richard's hands went cold around his coffee mug. He clicked the link. At that same moment, in a modest house on the quieter side of town, Dean Patricia Voss was scrolling through her own phone over a bowl of untouched oatmeal, her stomach twisting as the same video autoplayed on her screen, shared into a campus parents group she had joined years ago and mostly ignored. She set down her spoon. She watched the whole 90 seconds without blinking, and when it ended, she immediately dialed Frank Dolan, not caring that it was barely 7 in the morning. Frank, it's Voss. I need you at the office in 20 minutes. What happened? The video, she said, her voice tight. It's not secondhand anymore. It's everywhere. 11,000 views and climbing, and half the comments are asking why the college hasn't said anything yet. There was a pause on the line. You said yesterday we didn't have grounds without a formal complaint. I know what I said yesterday. Dean Voss snapped, then caught herself exhaling hard. I'm sorry. That's not fair to you. I was wrong, Frank. I let this sit because I didn't want to create a bigger story, and now the story's bigger than anything I could have controlled by acting sooner. She rubbed her eyes. Get me everything you can on those 3 students. Prior conduct, history, anything. I want it on my desk before this campus opens its doors today. And Mason Carter. Dean Voss was quiet for a moment, thinking of the email she'd read the day before, and set aside the one that had used words like assault and negligence, words she had brushed off as an overprotective parent's exaggeration. Find him, she said, before anyone else does. I owe that young man an apology, and I intend to give him one in person. She had no idea, hanging up the phone, that finding him in person that morning would be far more complicated than she imagined, because by the time campus security located Mason Carter, he would no longer be standing alone in a parking lot waiting for anyone to notice him. He would be standing in the middle of the loudest, most undeniable act of solidarity Whitmore Community College had ever seen. The video had been posted publicly less than 4 hours earlier. It already had over 11,000 views. Richard scrolled the comments, his breath coming faster with every line. Strangers calling for the college to expel the boys, involved strangers tagging local news stations, strangers writing things about his family, his business, his name that made the blood drain from his face. His phone rang. Tyler. "Dad, it's everywhere," Tyler said, panic cracking his voice for the first time. "People are sharing it. Someone posted my Instagram. There's people saying they're going to report it to the news." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the careful architecture of the last 24 hours collapsing around him. "I told you to make him delete it," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he understood how hollow they sounded now. "It doesn't matter anymore, Dad. Everybody already has it." "I know," Richard snapped, cutting him off. "I know." He stood up from the table, pacing the length of his kitchen, his mind racing through every angle a man like him instinctively reached for when a problem threatened to become public damage control, statements, lawyers, distancing himself from his own son if it came to that. What he did not yet understand, standing in his kitchen at 6 in the morning with his coffee going cold, was that somewhere across the city, more than 130 motorcycles were already being fueled, checked, and lined up in formation. He did not yet understand that his attempt to buy silence with a check the night before had done the opposite of what he intended. It had confirmed in Victor Hayes's mind exactly how far people with power would go to make inconvenient truths disappear. And he had no idea that in less than 3 hours, his son was going to watch that truth arrive at the front gates of Whitmore Community College in a way no lawyer, no check, and no carefully worded statement would ever be able to make disappear again. Mason woke to his alarm at 7, exhausted, his eyes swollen from a night of broken sleep, dreading the walk back into a building where he now knew, thanks to Emily, that a video of his worst moment was circulating whether the school acknowledged it or not. He didn't know about the 11,000 views. He didn't know about Richard Briggs pacing his kitchen in a cold sweat. He didn't know that his mother had spent the last 12 hours carrying a threat she hadn't told him about, or that a woman named Doc had driven through the night to Sacramento and back with a box in her passenger seat that would change the shape of his entire day. All he knew, sitting on the edge of his bed and reaching for the aluminum loaner crutches that still bit into his wrists, was that he had to go back to that campus one more time, and he had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him there. "You ready?" Laura asked from the doorway, her voice carefully steady, though Mason could see the tension around her eyes that hadn't been there 2 days ago. "No," he admitted honestly, "but I'm going anyway." Laura crossed the room and pulled him into a hug, holding on a beat longer than usual. "Whatever happens today," she said quietly, "you are not walking into it alone. I promise you that." Mason didn't understand yet how literally true that promise was about to become. He made his way down to the bus stop just after 8, the morning cold and gray, the same kind of overcast sky that had hung over the parking lot 2 days before. He kept his head down, one earbud, and trying to steady the anxious churn in his stomach with a playlist he barely heard. An older man sat down across the aisle from him a few stops later, glancing at the crutches, then at Mason's face, his eyebrows drawing together like he was trying to place him. "Hey, you're the kid from that video, aren't you?" Mason's stomach dropped. He said nothing, staring hard at the floor of the bus. "My grandson sent it to me last night," the man continued, and Mason braced himself, waiting for whatever cruelty or awkward pity usually came next. "Made me so damn angry I couldn't sleep. I called my daughter this morning and told her if I ever see her boys treat somebody like that, they won't sit down for a week." He shook his head slowly. "You didn't deserve that, son, not 1 second of it." Mason looked up, caught off guard by the rough sincerity in the stranger's voice. "Thank you," he managed. "Don't thank me. I didn't do anything." The man's jaw tightened. That's the whole problem, isn't it? Too many of us not doing anything. He got off 2 stops later, nodding once at Mason as he passed, and Mason sat there afterward, turning the exchange over in his mind, uncertain what to do with the strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. It didn't erase the 90 seconds of silence in that parking lot, But it was the first sign, small as it was, that something in the world outside his apartment had shifted since yesterday. He didn't notice 3 blocks away, the first low rumble of an engine joining a second, then a third, then a dozen more gathering at a rally point near the edge of town. Riders checking mirrors and helmets and glancing at their phones for the final confirmation from Victor. He didn't know that his mother, standing at her kitchen window with her own coffee going cold in her hands, had just received a text from a number she'd saved the night before under the name Victor Hayes. "We're on our way. Tell him to hold his head up today. He's got more people behind him than he knows." Laura read the message twice, her hand pressed against her mouth, tears rising fast and sudden. She didn't call Mason to warn him. She didn't know how to put into words what was coming, and some instinct in her, some quiet, aching hope she hadn't let herself feel in years, told her that some things needed to simply be witnessed rather than explained in advance. Across the city, in a garage that had emptied out overnight only to fill back up before dawn, Victor Hayes swung his leg over his bike, checked his mirrors, and looked out at the sea of riders stretched behind him in the gray morning light. 141 confirmed, with a handful more trickling in. Even now, engines idling, patches catching the weak early sun, every single one of them there for a 20-year-old kid they had never met, because somewhere along the way, each of them had learned exactly what it cost when nobody stopped. Preacher pulled up beside him, killing his engine for a moment. "You good?" Victor stared down the road toward Whitmore Community College, toward a parking lot where 2 days ago, a young man had sat alone on wet concrete and nobody had moved to help him. "I've been waiting to be good at this for 6 years, Victor said quietly. "Since the day I buried my brother and promised myself I wouldn't let it happen again in front of me." Preacher nodded, once understanding exactly what he meant. "Then let's go be good at it," he said, and pulled his helmet back down. Behind them, 141 engines roared to life almost in unison, the sound rolling out across the still morning air like something enormous. Finally waking up, and somewhere across town, a young man on a crowded bus had no idea that his entire world was about to be turned upside down by the one thing he had stopped believing in, the sound of people choosing to stand beside him. Mason made it through his 9 o'clock lecture without hearing a single word of one hit. He sat near the back, the aluminum crutches propped against the empty seat beside him, his eyes fixed on his notebook without actually seeing the notes he was supposed to be taking. Every few minutes, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Emily sending him screenshots of comments piling up under the video, strangers he'd never met, writing things like, "This kid deserves better." And where is the school in all this? And every buzz sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through his stomach. He didn't want to be famous for this. He didn't want strangers arguing about his pain in a comment section. He just wanted the ache in his wrists to stop, and the ache somewhere deeper than his wrists to stop along with it. At 9:40, a knock interrupted the lecture. Frank Dolan leaned into the room, scanning the rows until his eyes landed on Mason. "Mr. Carter, could you step out for a moment? Dean Voss would like a word." Mason's stomach dropped straight through the floor. He gathered his things, slowly aware of every eye in the room following him, aware of the whispered, "Is that him?" rippling through the students near the door. He followed Dolan into the hallway, bracing himself for exactly the kind of conversation he had spent 3 months dreading, the one where an adult in a position of authority explained in careful institutional language why nothing was really going to change. "Am I in trouble?" Mason asked. "No," Dolan said, and something in his tone made Mason look at him more closely. "Actually, quite the opposite. Dean Voss wants to apologize to you. In person." Mason blinked. "Apologize?" "She saw the video this morning, same as half the county, apparently." Dolan's jaw tightened. "I should have pushed harder yesterday. I'm sorry too, if that means anything." It meant something. It meant more than Mason expected it to. But before he could find words to answer, a sound reached them both through the hallway's exterior doors, faint at first, easy to mistake for a passing truck on the main road, the kind of sound that barely registered. Then it grew. Dolan's radio crackled at his hip. A voice tight with confusion cut through the static. "Dolan, you need to get to the main entrance, now." "What's going on?" I don't know how to explain it. Just get out here." Mason felt something cold slide down his spine. "What is that?" Dolan was already moving toward the exterior doors, and Mason followed as fast as the aluminum crutches would let him, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound had grown from a distant hum into something that filled the entire hallway, vibrating through the floor tiles, rattling the glass in the door frames. Students were pouring out of classrooms, up and down the corridor, phones already raised voices overlapping in confused, excited bursts. Is that, oh my God, look outside. What is happening right now? Mason pushed through the doors behind Dolan and stepped out into the gray morning light, and for a moment his mind simply refused to process what his eyes were showing him. The street bordering the campus, usually quiet at this hour, except for the occasional delivery truck, was filled from curb to curb with motorcycles. Not 5, not 20. A river of them, chrome and black leather, stretching back further than Mason could see, engines idling in a rolling wall of sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. His breath caught somewhere in his throat. "No way," he whispered. "No way." The lead bike peeled off from the formation and rolled slowly onto campus grounds, followed by another, then a dozen, then more than Mason could count, parking in careful, deliberate rows across the lot where 2 days earlier he had sat alone on wet concrete with nobody willing to help him up. Students froze mid-step. Professors appeared in doorways drawn by the noise, staring in open confusion. Somewhere behind Mason, a girl's voice said, "Is this a movie shoot? What is this?" It was not a movie shoot. One rider at the front of the formation swung his leg off his bike and pulled off his helmet, revealing a familiar gray beard and a face Mason had thought about every hour since the moment it first appeared, kneeling beside him on wet pavement. Victor. Mason's chest seized up with something too large to name. Disbelief, gratitude, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The exact thing he'd spent all of yesterday trying not to feel because he couldn't afford the fall if it turned out to be nothing. Victor walked toward him with the same unhurried certainty from 2 days before, the crowd of stunned students parting instinctively to let him through, and stopped a few feet away, his eyes moving briefly to the aluminum crutches still biting into Mason's wrists before landing back on his face. "Told you to give me 24 hours, Victor said. Mason's voice came out shaking. "You actually all of these." He gestured helplessly at the sea of leather and chrome behind him, unable to finish the sentence. 145 last count, Victor said. "Give or take a few more, still finding parking." "Why?" Mason's eyes burned. "Why would this many people?" "Because you thought nobody noticed," Victor said, his voice carrying now loud enough for the crowd of students pressing closer to hear every word. "Every single person behind me knows exactly what that feels like. And every single one of them decided today that you were done finding out alone." The crowd had gone completely silent. Phones raised the same students who 2 days earlier had watched Mason fall and done nothing, now watching a different kind of scene entirely, one where silence had finally been answered. Somewhere near the back of the gathering, Mason spotted a face he recognized instantly. Tyler Briggs stood frozen near the science building, his face drained of color, staring at the wall of motorcycles like he was watching his entire understanding of consequences arrive in physical form. Beside him, Connor and Dylan looked equally stricken, Dylan's phone hanging forgotten at his side for the first time in 3 months. "Mason." Dean Voss's voice cut through the moment, and Mason turned to find her approaching from the administrative building, her expression somewhere between shock and something that looked almost like relief. "I was coming to find you. I owe you an apology I should have offered yesterday." "Later, maybe," Mason said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his voice didn't shake with the effort of asking for anything. "Right now, I think something else is happening." Victor turned to face the assembled crowd, raising his voice without shouting, the kind of volume that came from decades of being heard over engine noise and didn't need to try hard to carry. 2 days ago, a young man sat right here. He gestured toward the parking lot behind him, with his crutches broken in half, and about 50 of you stood around and watched it happen. Nobody helped him up. Nobody said a word. His eyes swept the crowd slowly, and more than a few students looked away, shame coloring their faces. "I'm not here to shame anybody for freezing. Fear does strange things to people, and most folks have never been taught what courage actually costs until the moment it's required of them." He paused, letting that settle. "But I am here to make sure this young man never has to wonder again whether anybody's paying attention." Behind him, riders began dismounting in waves, opening saddlebags and storage compartments, and Mason watched in stunned silence as box after box was carried forward and set carefully on a folding table that had appeared as if from nowhere, unloaded by a broad-shouldered woman Mason didn't recognize yet. Doc moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done exactly this kind of work 1,000 times before. Angela Reyes, she said, extending a hand to Mason, her grip firm. Everybody calls me Doc. I drove to Sacramento last night and back to get you these. She opened the largest box, revealing a gleaming pair of carbon fiber forearm crutches, custom angled grips catching the gray morning light. Built to your measurements best I could estimate off what Victor described. We'll fine-tune the fit today if anything's off. Mason stared at the crutches, his throat closing up completely. His hands trembled as he reached out and touched the frame, running his fingers along the smooth carbon fiber, the same material, the same weight, the same careful engineering that had taken him 2 years of overtime shifts to afford the first time. I can't, his voice broke. I can't accept this. You can, Doc said gently, and you will, because somewhere out there is another kid who's gonna need somebody to do the same thing for them someday. And you're going to be the one who remembers what it felt like to receive it instead of just needing it. Mason lifted the crutches from the box with shaking hands, and the moment his palms wrapped around the custom grips, something in his chest cracked wide open. He set the aluminum loaners aside, the ones that had bitten into his wrist for 2 days, the ones that had reminded him with every step exactly how much he'd lost, and gripped the new crutches instead, testing his weight against them. They held perfectly, angled exactly right, built for him. He took one step, then another. No pain shooting through his wrists, no wrong angle digging into his palms. He looked up at Victor, tears finally spilling over, despite every effort to hold them back. They're perfect. Course they are, Victor said, his own voice rougher than usual. Doc doesn't do imperfect. The crowd around them had grown larger by the minute. More students pouring out of buildings, professors abandoning lectures entirely to witness what was unfolding in the parking lot. Phones were raised on every side now, but the energy had shifted completely from the confused, detached filming of 2 days before into something closer to reverence. That was when a new voice cut through the gathering sharp with barely controlled panic. Tyler? Where's Tyler? I need to find my son. Richard Briggs pushed through the edge of the crowd, still in the same pressed shirt from his kitchen that morning, his eyes wild as they landed first on the sea of motorcycles, then on his son standing pale and frozen near the science building, then finally on Victor Hayes standing at the center of it all. What is this? Richard demanded, striding forward with the forced authority of a man used to controlling every room he entered. Is this some kind of intimidation stunt? You bring 100 bikers onto a college campus to threaten teenagers? Victor turned to face him slowly, and something in his expression made even Richard falter half a step. Mr. Briggs, Victor said, his voice deceptively calm. Funny you should show up right now. I know exactly who you people are. Richard said, his voice rising, playing now to the crowd of students and the growing cluster of phones. This is exactly the kind of behavior I warned about. Gang intimidation on school property. I'll have every single one of these bikes towed. I'll have your club investigated. I have lawyers who... Richard? Laura Carter's voice came from behind him, quiet but steady, and Richard spun around to find her standing there, arms crossed, having arrived only minutes earlier after Victor's early morning text sent her rushing across town. Richard's face went through a rapid, visible calculation. Mrs. Carter, I didn't expect... You called me yesterday afternoon, Laura said loud enough now for the crowd pressing closer to hear every word. You offered to write a check to cover Mason's new equipment. Do you remember what you asked for in return? Richard's jaw tightened. I offered to help your family. That's all that call was. You asked me to keep it private. Laura continued, her voice trembling, slightly but not breaking. Between families, you said. And when I told you I wouldn't take money to buy my silence, you told me accusations could go both ways. You told me my son's name could get connected to something ugly if I didn't cooperate. A ripple moved through the crowd, phones angling toward Richard now instead of the bikers. That is a gross mischaracterization of a private conversation, Richard said, his composure cracking at the edges. Is it? Laura reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone, holding it up. Because I recorded it. I didn't plan to. My phone was already recording a voice memo from an earlier call with the school, and I forgot to stop it before you called. I have the whole thing, Richard. Every word. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stared at the phone in Laura's hand like it might bite him, his mouth opening and closing without sound emerging. He finally managed. You can't just... I already sent a copy to Dean Voss this morning, Laura said, before I even got here. I wasn't sure I'd need it. I'm starting to think I did. Dean Voss, standing at the edge of the crowd, confirmed with a small, grim nod. I received it 40 minutes ago, Mr. Briggs. I was actually in the process of reviewing it when she gestured at the motorcycles, arrived. Richard's face had gone the color of old ash. He turned toward Tyler, some final desperate instinct reaching for a control of the situation. But Tyler was no longer looking at him at all. Tyler was staring at the recording device in Laura's hand, at the crowd of phones now pointed at his father, at the wreckage of whatever careful damage control plan had brought him rushing to campus in the first place. Dad, Tyler said quietly, what did you do? I was trying to protect this family, Richard snapped, though the authority had drained almost entirely out of his voice. By threatening a kid who's disabled, Tyler's voice cracked something raw, breaking through the panic. By threatening his mom, you have no idea what you're talking about. I have a pretty good idea, actually. Tyler's hands were shaking. He looked over at Mason standing there with his new crutches, surrounded by 145 people who had shown up for him without being asked, and something in Tyler's face crumpled entirely. I broke his crutches, Dad. I laughed while I did it, and then you tried to pay his mom to make it disappear. Tyler. I'm done, Tyler said, his voice shaking but suddenly surprisingly firm. I'm done letting you handle things for me. He turned and walked toward Mason, ignoring his father's furious protest behind him, stopping a few feet away, his face pale and stricken. I don't expect you to forgive me, Tyler said, his voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. I don't even think I deserve the chance to ask. But I need you to know I'm sorry, not because my dad got caught trying to cover it up. Because what I did was wrong, and I knew it was wrong the whole time. And I did it anyway because it felt easy and because nobody ever told me it would cost me anything. Mason studied him for a long moment at the crowd holding its breath around them. It cost me 2 years of savings and 3 months of feeling like I didn't matter. Mason said finally, his voice steady despite everything churning underneath it. I don't know if sorry fixes that, but it's more than you said 2 days ago. I know it doesn't fix it, Tyler said. I just needed you to hear it anyway. Nearby, Connor and Dylan stood frozen watching this exchange, the reality of the morning finally landing on both of them with visible weight. Dylan's phone was still in his hand, but for the first time in 3 months, he wasn't filming anything at all. Dean Voss turned toward them next, and Connor flinched like he expected to be struck. Mr. Wells, Mr. Hart, do either of you have anything you'd like to say given everything that's just come to light? Connor stared at the ground, his jaw working. I don't even know why I did it, honestly. Tyler and Dylan were laughing, and it just felt like something to do. That sounds so stupid saying it out loud now. It is stupid, Mason said, not unkindly, just flatly true. That's kind of the point. You never even hated me. You just didn't think I mattered enough to be worth the effort of stopping. Connor's face crumpled slightly, and for once he didn't argue. Dylan was quieter, turning his phone over in his hands, like he wasn't sure what to do with it anymore. I told myself I was just documenting it, like I was some kind of observer instead of part of it. He shook his head slowly. I filmed 90 seconds of you asking for help, and I never once considered putting the phone down and actually helping. I don't have an excuse for that. I just have that fact, and I'm going to have to live with it. Good, Victor said, quietly stepping into the exchange for the first time. Not because I want you to suffer over it, because that discomfort you're feeling right now, that's the beginning of becoming somebody different than the kid who filmed it. Don't waste it feeling sorry for yourself. Spend it becoming somebody who'd put the phone down next time. Dean Voss stepped forward, then addressing the crowd directly, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had decided finally to stop hedging. I want every student here to understand something, she said. Yesterday, I made a mistake. I treated a serious allegation of bullying as something to be handled carefully and quietly because quietly is easier for an institution to manage than the truth. I was wrong to do that, and I'm sorry, Mason, that it took a recording and 145 motorcycles to make me act with the urgency this deserved from the start. She turned toward Tyler, Connor, and Dylan, her expression hardening. Effective immediately, all 3 of you are suspended pending a full disciplinary hearing during which the college will review the video evidence, the pattern of harassment described in multiple statements, and today's events. I would also strongly encourage your families to seek legal counsel, given what appears to be a documented attempt to obstruct that investigation. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but the words seemed to die somewhere in his throat as he took in the crowd around him. Students filming a dean who had just publicly reversed course, a woman holding a recording that could end more than just his son's semester, and 145 bikers who had not raised a single hand in violence and had still somehow dismantled his entire plan within 20 minutes of arriving. He turned and walked away without another word, his pace quickening into something close to a retreat, and nobody in the crowd moved to stop him because nobody needed to. Some victories didn't require force. They just required the truth finally being allowed to stand in daylight. Mason watched him go, an odd, hollow feeling settling where he expected triumph to be. He had spent 3 months imagining this moment, the bully's exposed consequences, finally landing, and now that it had arrived, what he actually felt was exhaustion. And underneath the exhaustion, something quieter and more surprising relief that it was at last simply over. Victor seemed to read the shift in him instantly. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so it was just between the two of them. "Doesn't feel the way you thought it would, does it?" Mason shook his head slowly. "I thought I'd feel like I won something." "You did win something," Victor said. "Just not the something you expected. You didn't win revenge. You won proof. Proof that you were never invisible no matter how hard the world worked to convince you otherwise." Before Mason could respond, a new voice called out from the edge of the crowd, a young woman with a microphone and a cameraman jogging to keep pace beside her, having clearly abandoned whatever assignment she'd started the day with. The moment word reached the newsroom, about 145 motorcycles converging on a local college. "Excuse me, are you Mason Carter?" She was slightly out of breath. "I'm with Channel 9. We got tipped off about a video that's been circulating, and then this," she gestured at the rows of parked bikes. "Call came through the scanner about an hour ago. Would you be willing to talk to us?" Mason looked at Victor, uncertain, an old instinct rising to shrink away from attention rather than step into it. "Your story," Victor said quietly. "Your choice. Nobody here's going to make you do anything you don't want to do." Mason turned back to the reporter, drawing a slow breath, feeling the solid, perfect weight of his new crutches beneath his palms. "Yeah," he said, "I'll talk." The interview that followed would later be replayed on local news broadcasts across 3 counties, then picked up by regional outlets, then finally clipped and shared far beyond Nevada entirely. But in the moment, none of that mattered to Mason. What mattered was the reporter's simple first question, and the fact that for once, he didn't have to shrink his answer to make anyone comfortable. "Can you tell us what happened here today?" Mason looked out at the crowd, at Victor, at Doc, at Tank, and Preacher, and Cole, and the dozens of other riders whose names he hadn't learned yet, but whose faces he would never forget, at his mother standing near the folding table, with tears streaming freely down her face, at Emily, near the front of the crowd, mouthing, "You okay?" with genuine concern, at Dean Voss standing a respectful distance away, at Tyler still frozen near the science building, looking like a boy who had just watched his entire understanding of consequences rearrange itself in real time. 2 days ago, Mason said, his voice steady, carrying further than he expected it to, 3 people broke my crutches in this parking lot, while about 50 other people watched and did nothing. I sat right there, he pointed toward the cracked stretch of sidewalk near the science building, and I asked for help and nobody moved. He paused, looking around at the sea of leather and chrome surrounding him. Today, 145 strangers rode across the state because one man decided that wasn't going to be the end of my story. I don't know all their names yet. I don't know most of their stories, but I know they showed up for someone they'd never met because somewhere along the way, every single one of them learned exactly what it must when nobody does. The reporter's eyes had gone slightly glassy. What would you say to the people watching this right now? Mason thought for a moment, his gaze drifting to the crowd of students who 2 days earlier had filmed his humiliation and today were filming something entirely different. I'd say the next time you see somebody struggling and you feel that instinct to look away because it's easier, don't. His voice cracked slightly and he let it, no longer interested in hiding what any of this cost him. It's never actually easier. It just feels that way in the moment. The cost just shows up later in the person you become, after choosing silence enough times. Behind him, without anyone orchestrating it, without any signal passed between them, the 145 riders began revving their engines in a slow rolling wave, not aggressive, not threatening, but something closer to applause. A mechanical roar of solidarity that rippled from the front of the formation to the back, and rolled out over the entire campus, like thunder finally breaking after days of pressure building in the sky. The reporter turned her microphone briefly toward Victor before he could step away, catching him off guard. "Sir, can I ask what made you stop that day? 145 people don't just show up for a stranger." Victor was quiet a moment, glancing at Mason before answering. "I had a brother who spent his whole life being treated like his disability made him less than everybody else around him. I wasn't there enough for him when it mattered. I told myself a long time ago that if I ever got another chance to be the person who stops, I'd take it." He nodded toward Mason. This was that chance. "And the others? All these riders. Every one of them's got their own version of that story," Victor said. "Somebody they didn't show up for in time, or somebody who never showed up for to them. Today wasn't really about a broken pair of crutches. It was about 145 people finally getting to do something about the regret they've been carrying." The reporter nodded slowly, clearly moved, and let the moment breathe before turning back to her camera. Students who had stood frozen 2 days earlier now stood cheering, some crying openly, the particular release of a crowd that had been carrying secondhand guilt for 48 hours and finally found somewhere to put it down. Emily pushed through the crowd toward Mason, her own eyes wet. "I emailed the dean. I sent you the video. I should have done more that day, but I promise you from now on, I'm not going to be the person who freezes." "You already weren't," Mason said. "You just didn't see it yet." A woman Mason didn't recognize hurried up beside Emily, slightly out of breath, clearly having rushed straight from her car. "You're Mason," she said. "I'm Emily's mom, Renee. I'm the one who sent that video to the dean this morning. I hope that was all right. I didn't know what else to do with it once my daughter told me what she saw." "It was more than all right," Mason said. "It's part of the reason any of this happened at all." Renee's eyes welled up. "I keep thinking about all the other kids who go through something like this, and nobody ever sends the email. Nobody ever makes the call." She glanced at her daughter. "I'm glad she told me. I'm glad she didn't just let it disappear the way these things usually do." A young man Mason vaguely recognized from his engineering lecture approached next, hovering awkwardly at the edge of the conversation before speaking. "I was there too, 2 days ago. I didn't film it, but I didn't do anything either, and I've felt sick about it since." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't have a good excuse. I just wanted you to know I saw it, and I'm not going to be the guy who does nothing next time." Mason nodded slowly, something settling in his chest with each new admission. "That's really all any of this was ever asking for. Just don't do nothing." Nearby, Laura finally reached her son, pulling him into an embrace so fierce it nearly knocked him off balance. New crutches and all. "I am so proud of you," she whispered into his shoulder. "I have never not for one single day been more proud of you than I am right now." "I didn't do this, Mom," Mason said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "They did. They showed up," Laura said, pulling back to look at him. "But you're the one who's been surviving this for 3 months without ever once giving anybody the satisfaction of watching you break. That part was always you." Victor watched the reunion from a few feet away, something bittersweet moving across his face. The particular ache of a man who had spent 6 years wishing he had shown up sooner for somebody else. Doc appeared at his shoulder, following his gaze. "You all right?" "Just thinking about Danny," Victor said quietly, wondering if this is what it would have looked like, if I'd shown up in time for him. "You showed up today," Doc said. "That counts. That always counts." Preacher approached them both, his phone in hand, scrolling through something with a slight frown. "Victor, you're going to want to see this." He turned the screen around. The video of Mason's original humiliation had climbed past 40,000 views in the last hour alone. But underneath it, a new video was already spreading footage of the last 20 minutes of 145 motorcycles arriving, of Mason receiving his new crutches, of Richard Briggs's public unraveling. All of it captured from a dozen different angles and stitched together by strangers who had never met any of them. "It's moving fast," Preacher said. "Real fast." Victor exhaled slowly, watching the numbers climb even as he stood there. "Good. Let it move. Let every kid out there who's ever sat alone on a sidewalk see exactly what showing up looks like." Near the folding table, Doc was already unpacking the second box, the one containing the financial assistance paperwork and the first documents outlining what would eventually become a proper scholarship fund, though none of them knew yet how large that fund was about to grow once the video reached its widest audience. Mason noticed the paperwork and frowned, stepping closer. "What's all this?" Financial assistance, Doc explained. Coverage for outstanding medical costs related to your leg, plus a fund specifically for disabled students at this college who need adaptive equipment and can't afford it. We started drafting it last night once Victor told us what your mom's been dealing with. Mason looked over at his mother, who had gone very still, one hand pressed against her mouth. You don't have to accept it today, Doc added gently. There's no pressure. It'll be here whenever you're ready. Laura's voice came out thick with emotion. Why would you do all of this for people you just met? Doc glanced toward Victor before answering, something quiet and understanding passing between them. Because every one of us has stood exactly where you're standing right now, needing help and terrified to accept it because somewhere along the way, the world convinced you needing help makes you a burden instead of just making you human. She squeezed Laura's shoulder. It doesn't. It never did. Let us help carry this. That's all we're asking. Laura broke down completely. Then the exhaustion of months finally catching up with her all at once, and Victor stepped forward without hesitation, wrapping one steady arm around her shoulders while she cried, saying nothing, simply standing there as the kind of solid, unmovable presence that Laura hadn't felt beside her in longer than she could remember. Across the parking lot, Dean Voss approached Victor once the moment had settled, extending a hand. I owe you an apology, too, Mr. Hayes. I misjudged what today would look like when Frank first told me a large group of motorcyclists was headed for campus. I expected trouble. Most people do, Victor said, shaking her hand. Funny how the folks who look the most dangerous are usually the ones showing up to help, and the ones who look the most respectable are usually the ones trying to buy their way out of consequences. Dean Voss allowed herself a small, tired smile. Point taken. I'd like your word on something, Victor added. Not a threat, just a request. Go ahead. Make sure this doesn't quietly disappear once the cameras leave. Mason deserves a real investigation, real consequences, and a campus that actually protects the next kid this happens to, not just today's headline. You have my word, Dean Voss said, and for what it's worth, I intend to keep it. By early afternoon, the crowd had begun to thin, riders slowly remounting their bikes in small groups, engines starting up in a rolling patchwork of sound, far gentler than the thunderous arrival that morning. Mason stood near the edge of the lot, his new crutches solid beneath him, watching the campus slowly return to something resembling its normal rhythm. Though nothing about it felt normal anymore, not to him, not after everything the last 3 days had unraveled and rebuilt in equal measure. Tank approached him before leaving, extending a massive hand. You did good today, kid. Real good. I didn't really do anything, Mason said. I just stood here. Standing here after everything you have survived without letting it turn you bitter or make you disappear. Tank shook his head slowly. That's not nothing. That's the hardest part, and you did it for 3 whole months before any of us ever showed up. Cole passed by next, offering an awkward but genuine fist bump. For what it's worth, man, that thing you said to the reporter about the cost showing up later. That's gonna stick with me a long time. One by one, riders Mason had never met and would likely never see again stopped to offer some small word of encouragement, a nod, a handshake, a story fragment about their own kid, their own brother, their own memory of being underestimated, and Mason found himself absorbing each one like water into dry ground, filling something in him that had been empty for far longer than 3 months. Sandra stopped next, her voice gentler than the others. My mother spent the last years of her life in a home where the staff talked over her like she wasn't in the room just because her memory wasn't what it used to be. I used to lie awake wondering if anybody ever stood up for her in those moments, or if she just sat there feeling exactly the way you must have felt on that sidewalk. She reached out and squeezed Mason's hand. I couldn't go back and change that for her. But I could show up for you, so I did. A quieter rider, a young veteran named Marcus, who hadn't spoken much all morning, lingered a moment longer than the rest. I lost part of my leg overseas, he said, simply glancing down at Mason's new crutches. Spent a year after I got home, feeling like the whole world was waiting for me to disappear quietly so nobody had to look at what happened to me. Nobody showed up for me the way we showed up for you today. Wish somebody had. He offered a small, tired smile. Glad I got to be that for somebody else instead. Mason didn't have words for that one. He just nodded, throat too tight to speak, and Marcus seemed to understand exactly why. Victor was the last to approach his helmet, already back in hand, the crowd behind him thinning toward the exit. You heading out? Mason asked, an unexpected pang of something like loss moving through him at the thought. Not going far, Victor said. This isn't goodbye, son. Not even close. You've got my number. Use it whenever you need to, day or night, doesn't matter. I don't know how to thank you for this, Mason said. Any of it. You don't need to thank me, Victor said. Just do what you told that reporter. Don't look away next time you see somebody else sitting where you were sitting 2 days ago. Pass it forward. That's the only payment I ever want. He clasped Mason's shoulder once firm and brief and turned to swing his leg back over his bike. Victor, Io, Mason called out before he could pull his helmet on. Victor paused, looking back. Thank you for stopping, Mason said. 2 days ago, when nobody else would. Something moved across Victor's weathered face, quiet and unguarded. Thank you for saying 4 words that mattered enough to stop for. He pulled his helmet down, kicked his bike to life, and rolled slowly out of the lot, the sound of his engine joining the dwindling chorus of the others as the last of 145 riders made their way back onto the road they had all traveled together at dawn. Mason stood there long after the final engine faded into the distance, his mother's hand resting warm on his shoulder, the new crutches solid and perfect beneath his palms, the campus around him quiet in a way that felt entirely different from the silence of 2 days before. That silence had been the sound of people looking away. This one was the sound of everything finally permanently changed. By the following morning, Mason's phone had stopped feeling like his own. 43 missed calls, interview requests from stations he'd never heard of, a producer from a morning show in Sacramento asking if he'd fly out for a segment, strangers finding his personal number through channels he couldn't even guess at, and texting him messages that ranged from tearfully grateful to deeply unsettlingly personal. He sat at the kitchen table staring at the screen. The new crutches leaned against the wall behind him, exactly where the broken ones used to lean. You don't have to answer any of it, Laura said, setting a mug of coffee in front of him. Not one single call if you don't want to. I know. Mason turned the phone face down. I just don't know what I want yet. 2 days ago, nobody knew my name. Now everybody wants a piece of it. That's allowed to feel like too much, Laura said. Even when it's good, especially when it's good sometimes. His phone buzzed again despite being face down, and this time Mason recognized the number. Victor. He flipped it over and answered on the second ring the same way Victor always seemed to answer his. How you holding up? Victor asked, no preamble, his voice rough with something that sounded like it hadn't slept much either. Honestly, kind of drowning. Figured you might be. That's part of why I'm calling. A pause. Dean Voss's office reached out to the chapter this morning. The disciplinary hearing set for Thursday. They want you there to give a statement if you're willing. Nobody's going to force you. Mason's stomach tightened. What happens if I don't go? Then they proceed with the video and whatever written statements they've got. But your voice matters more than any of that, son. A room full of people deciding somebody else's fate goes different when the person who actually lived it is standing in front of them instead of just a screen. Mason was quiet for a moment, staring at the new crutches leaning against the wall. I'll be there. Didn't figure you for the type to hide from something once you decided to stop being invisible. Victor said something like pride threading through the gravel of his voice. 2 days later, that pride would be tested in ways none of them fully anticipated. The test came sooner than Victor expected in the form of a black and white Reno PD cruiser pulling into the chapter's garage lot just after 9 that morning, 2 officers stepping out with the careful, deliberate posture of men who'd been sent to ask questions they weren't entirely sure they wanted answers to. Victor met them in the doorway, wiping grease from his hands with a shop rag, his expression giving away nothing. Morning, officers. Something I can help with. Mr. Hayes, the older officer asked, we received a complaint yesterday afternoon regarding a large gathering of motorcycles at Whitmore Community College, filed by a Mr. Richard Briggs, alleging intimidation and unlawful assembly. 145 people rode peacefully onto a public college campus, delivered medical equipment to a disabled student, and left without a single incident. Victor said evenly, you got the footage same as everybody else does by now. You see any intimidation in it? The younger officer glanced at his partner, visibly uncomfortable. We're just following up on the complaint, sir. Standard procedure. I understand that, Victor said, and I'll cooperate with whatever you need. But I want you both to understand something plainly, so there's no confusion later. Every permit for that gathering was filed properly 2 days in advance. Every rider present is a member in good standing with a documented reason for being there. And the only person in this entire situation who's broken any law appears to be the man who filed your complaint, given the recorded call, currently sitting with a lawyer downtown. The older officer studied him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, not quite an apology but close to one. We watched the footage before we came out here. Didn't look like intimidation to us either. But we've got a job to do. I respect that, Victor said. Ask me anything you need. The questioning lasted 40 minutes, methodical and thorough, and by the end of it, both officers seemed less like men executing a complaint and more like men going through the motions of a formality neither of them believed in. For what it's worth, the younger officer said as they turned to leave, my sister's in a wheelchair. She sent me that video last night before I even knew I'd be out here today. Told me if I ever saw anybody treat her the way that kid got treated, she wanted to know I'd do something about it. He hesitated, then added quieter, appreciate what you all did, off the record, Victor nodded once, watching the cruiser pull away, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. He called Diane Okafor immediately to update her, and within the hour she'd already drafted a formal response to the complaint of attaching the permit documentation and a pointed reference to the recorded conversation that Richard Briggs's own legal team was still scrambling to explain away. He's grasping at anything that might slow this down, Diane told Victor over the phone. Filing complaints, threatening lawsuits, hoping something sticks before the disciplinary hearing. It won't work, but I understand why it's exhausting to watch him try. On Wednesday afternoon, a courier arrived at the Carter apartment with a certified letter, thick and official, bearing the letterhead of a law firm Mason didn't recognize, Whitfield Marsh & Cole, the kind of name that took up an entire floor of some downtown office building. Laura's hand shook slightly as she opened it, reading through the dense legal language twice before she understood what she was looking at. What is it? Mason asked. Richard Briggs's lawyers, Laura said slowly. They're threatening to sue me for the recording. They can't do that. You didn't do anything wrong. They're claiming Nevada requires two-party consent to record a phone call and that I violated his privacy by recording without his knowledge. Laura's voice wavered between fear and disbelief. They're threatening damages. Real money, Mason. Money we absolutely do not have. Mason felt the old familiar cold spreading through his chest, the sensation of watching someone with power find a new angle to hurt the people who had finally stood up to him. He called Victor immediately, reading the letter over the phone word for word. Victor listened in silence, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone flat and certain in a way Mason was starting to recognize as the sound of a problem about to be solved. Nevada's a one-party consent state, Victor said, meaning as long as your mother was a participant in that call, which she was since he called her directly, she only needed her own consent to record it. Not his. That letter's a bluff, plain and simple. Somebody's lawyer billing hours to scare a scared woman into backing down. Are you sure? I'm sure enough to make a call, myself, Victor said. I've got a lawyer on retainer for the chapter, handles our permits, our insurance disputes, that kind of thing. I'm going to have her look at this today, and I'm going to have her write Richard Briggs' firm a response so clear they won't have any question about where this actually stands. That evening, the chapter's attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Okafor, called Laura directly to walk her through exactly why the threat held no legal water. Her voice calm and reassuring in the particular way of someone who had spent decades untangling exactly this kind of intimidation tactic. They're not going to file, Diane said. Filing means discovery, and discovery means every text message, every internal email at that dealership becomes fair game if this actually goes to court. Mr. Briggs does not want a judge reading his communications about how to handle this quietly. This letter is meant to scare you into silence before it ever sees a courtroom. Don't let it. Laura exhaled a breath that she felt like she'd been holding for 2 days straight. Thank you. I don't know how to repay something like this. You don't, Diane said simply. This is what the chapter does. Consider it part of the same 24 hours Victor promised your son. Some promises take longer to finish keeping than others. 2 days later at the disciplinary hearing, Mason discovered exactly how much longer. The hearing room at Whitmore Community College felt smaller than Mason expected. A long table at the front where Dean Voss sat flanked by 2 other administrators and a representative from the college's legal counsel, rows of chairs facing them, where witnesses and involved parties waited their turn to speak. Mason sat beside his mother, his new crutches resting against his knee, watching Tyler, Connor, and Dylan file in on the opposite side of the room with their families. Richard Briggs sat rigid beside his mom, his face carefully arranged into an expression of contrition that didn't quite reach his eyes. Connor's parents looked exhausted, older somehow than Mason remembered from the parking lot 2 days earlier. Dylan's mother sat alone, her posture stiff, a lawyer beside her instead of a spouse. Dean Voss opened the proceedings without preamble. We are here to review the events of the past several days involving Mason Carter, Tyler Briggs, Connor Wells, and Dylan Hart, along with a documented pattern of prior conduct that has since come to light. The board has reviewed video evidence, written statements, and will now hear testimony directly. The words prior conduct that has since come to light landed heavier than Mason expected, and he glanced at Victor, seated a few rows back, arms crossed, watching everything with quiet, unwavering attention, uncertain what exactly the dean meant. He found out within minutes. A young woman Mason didn't recognize was called forward, first seated at a small table facing the board, her hands trembling slightly as she began to speak. My name's Priya Malhotra. I'm a freshman here. I wanted to come forward after I saw what happened to Mason because I realized I'd seen this before. Not exactly the same, but close enough that it made my stomach turn. She glanced briefly at Tyler before continuing. Last semester before Mason, there was a janitor here named Mr. Alvarez. Older man walked with a limp. Tyler and his friends used to imitate the way he walked when he passed by the cafeteria. Called him names. I saw it happen at least 4 or 5 times. I never said anything because I was scared it would turn on me next. Mason felt something cold settle in his stomach. He hadn't known. He hadn't known any of it. Dean Voss's expression tightened. Do you know if Mr. Alvarez ever reported this? I don't think he did, Priya said. I think he just kept his head down and did his job and hoped it would stop eventually. A second student came forward after her, a young man with a stutter, who described being mocked in a similar pattern the year before, the same trio of names repeating with sickening familiarity. Then a third, a woman describing an incident involving a wheelchair-bound student 2 years back who had transferred out of the college entirely, rather than continue enduring what Tyler and his circle found entertaining. Dylan's lawyer rose partway through the fourth account, clearing his throat. Dean Voss, with respect, none of this third-hand testimony has been substantiated through a formal complaint process. My client's due process rights. Your client filmed a disabled student being assaulted and shared it for entertainment. Dean Voss said, her voice cutting through his objection without raising in volume. Due process is precisely what he is receiving right now. Counselor, this board is not a courtroom, and I would ask you to let the witnesses finish. The lawyer sat back down, and Dylan's mother pressed a hand over her eyes, her shoulders curling inward. By the time the fourth account concluded, the room had gone entirely silent. The weight of what had actually been happening at Whitmore Community College for years finally settling over everyone present. Richard Briggs's face had drained of color entirely. He leaned toward his son, whispering something urgent, but Tyler shook his head, slightly refusing to engage. Is any of this true? Dean Voss asked Tyler directly. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he finally looked up, his voice came out, hollow, stripped of the panic and bluster from 2 days earlier. Yes, he said simply. All of it. I didn't think of it as anything at the time. It just felt like, I don't know, something we did, something that made people laugh. And now, Dean Voss pressed. Now I think about how many people I did that to before Mason, Tyler said, his voice cracking, and how none of them ever got 145 motorcycles showing up for them. They just had to live with it. The admission landed like a stone dropped into still water ripples, spreading through the room in the form of shifting postures, exchanged glances. Richard Briggs pressing a hand over his mouth as though trying to physically hold back whatever protest was forming there. When it came time for Mason to speak, Dean Voss called his name gently, and Mason made his way to the small table at the front, settling his new crutches against the chair beside him, aware of every eye in the room following his movement. Mason, Dean Voss said, would you like to share anything with the board? Mason had rehearsed something the night before, lying awake staring at the ceiling, the way he had every night that week, trying to find words large enough to hold 3 months of silent suffering. But sitting there now facing the room, all of that careful rehearsal fell away, replaced by something simpler and truer. I keep hearing people call this a victory, Mason said slowly, like it's some kind of triumph story. And I get why. 145 bikers showing up, the video going viral. Richard Briggs's threats getting exposed. I understand why that reads as winning. He paused, gathering himself. But I don't want revenge. I never wanted revenge. What I wanted this whole time was so much simpler than that. His voice wavered and he let it. I wanted someone to notice. The room stayed utterly silent. For 3 months, I sat in classes with people who watched me get mocked and said nothing. I sat in that parking lot with 50 people around me, and not one of them moved. I started to believe that was just how the world worked, that being disabled meant being invisible, and being invisible meant nobody was ever going to step in, no matter how bad it got. He looked up, finding Victor's eyes across the room, and then one man stopped. Just one. And it turns out that's all it actually takes to change everything. Not 145 people. Just one person deciding you're worth stopping for. He turned back to face Tyler, Connor, and Dylan directly. I don't need you punished to feel like this mattered. I need you to understand that the version of yourselves who did this, who thought a disabled kid's crutches and an old janitor's limp were something to laugh at, that version of you is the problem. Not because you got caught, because you never should have needed to get caught to understand it was wrong. Connor was openly crying by the time Mason finished. Dylan stared at the floor, motionless. Tyler's jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. Dean Voss let the silence hold for a long moment before speaking again. Thank you, Mason. That took considerable courage. She turned to the board beside her, conferring quietly for several minutes, while the room waited before finally addressing the full hearing again. Given the severity and documented pattern of the conduct described today, the board has reached the following determinations. She read from her notes, her voice steady and formal now. Tyler Briggs is expelled from Whitmore Community College, effective immediately, with the incident formally noted in his academic record. Dylan Hart is expelled under the same terms given his role in documenting and disseminating the harassment for entertainment rather than accountability. Connor Wells will be suspended for the remainder of the academic year, required to complete a documented restorative justice program, working directly with the Campus Disability Services Office, after which his continued enrollment will be reviewed. Connor's parents exhaled, audibly, relief and grief tangled together in equal measure. Dylan's mother's face crumpled. Richard Briggs sat rigid, staring straight ahead, his carefully constructed composure finally completely gone. Additionally, Dean Voss continued, the college will be implementing a new formal reporting and protection policy for students with disabilities developed in consultation with Mason Carter and disability advocates to ensure that future concerns are treated with the urgency they deserve from the outset, rather than requiring public pressure to force appropriate action. She looked directly at Mason as she said it, something like genuine gratitude in her expression. This hearing is adjourned. The room began to empty slowly, families gathering their things in heavy silence. But Richard Briggs remained seated a moment longer, staring at nothing before finally rising and following his son out without another word to anyone. Mason watched him go, waiting to feel the satisfaction he'd expected, and finding instead only a quiet, settled kind of peace. Outside the hearing room, Victor was waiting, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and when Mason approached, he pushed off and met him halfway. How you feeling? Lighter, Mason admitted. I didn't expect that. I thought I'd feel angrier watching it all get decided. Instead, I just feel like I can breathe. That's what happens when the truth finally gets to stand up straight instead of getting talked over, Victor said. Takes a weight off everybody it touches, not just the person who's been carrying it. Laura joined them, her eyes red, but her expression lighter than Mason had seen it in months. I keep thinking about that janitor, she said quietly. Mr. Alvarez, nobody ever stood up for him. Somebody's going to now, Victor said. Dean Voss mentioned reaching out to him personally, offering support, maybe bringing him in as a consultant on that new policy. This isn't just closing one chapter, Mrs. Carter. It's cracking open a door that's been shut a long time at this college. A week into his restorative justice placement, Connor Wells showed up at the Campus Disability Services Office looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. But he showed up anyway every single day exactly as required. His supervisor there, a soft-spoken woman named Grace, who coordinated accommodations for over 200 students, assigned him to help catalog and repair loaner equipment in the back office, wheelchairs, hearing devices, adaptive keyboards, the unglamorous machinery of accessibility that most students never thought twice about. You know why you're doing this instead of just sitting through a lecture on empathy? Grace asked him on his third day, watching him carefully realign a wheelchair wheel that had been sitting crooked for months. Because it's supposed to teach me something, Connor said, not looking up. Because these machines, Grace said, gesturing around the cluttered back room, represent the actual physical difference between somebody getting to live their life and somebody getting left behind. You spent months treating a piece of equipment like Mason's crutches as a joke. I want you spending the next several months understanding with your own hands exactly what it takes to build and maintain the thing you thought was funny to destroy. Connor didn't have an answer for that. He just kept working, and by the end of the semester, something in the set of his shoulders had changed in a way even his own parents struggled to name. Though Mason, passing him once in the hallway near the equipment office, saw it clearly enough. The particular quiet of somebody who had finally stopped performing and started actually reckoning. That evening back at the apartment, Mason sat on the couch scrolling through his phone, a habit he'd been trying to break, but the pull of watching the story continue to spread proved hard to resist. The original video had crossed 2 million views. News outlets from 3 states over had picked up the story. The phone rang with a call Mason almost declined out of sheer exhaustion, a producer from a national morning show. Her voice bright and practiced, explaining that they'd love to fly the whole family to New York for a live segment, all expenses covered, a chance to tell their story to millions. Mason put her on speaker so Laura could hear. "We really appreciate the interest," Laura said carefully, "but I think we need some time to think about it." "Of course, totally understandable," the producer said smoothly. "Just wanted to mention we'd also love to have Victor Hayes and some of the other writers join, if that's something Mason would want." Really rounds out the story. After the call ended, Mason sat with the phone in his lap for a long moment. "Part of me wants to say yes, show everybody what actually happened in my own words before somebody else tells it wrong." "And the other part?" Laura asked. "The other part just wants to go back to being a regular engineering student who nobody recognizes in the hallway." He rubbed his eyes. "I don't know how to want both those things at once." "You don't have to decide today," Laura said, "and whatever you decide, it doesn't have to be forever. You can say yes to one thing and no to the next. Nobody signed you up for a permanent job here." Mason called Victor later that night, turning the decision over out loud, and Victor's answer came without hesitation. "Do what actually serves the thing you care about," Victor said. "If going on that show helps another kid like Priya feel safe enough to speak up, that's worth the discomfort. If it just feeds something that doesn't actually help anybody, but the ratings, you're allowed to say no. You don't owe strangers your whole story just because they're curious about it." In the end, Mason agreed to a single carefully worded written interview with a respected regional outlet and declined everything else, a decision that cost him some momentary backlash online from people who felt entitled to more of him than he was willing to give, but left him for the first time in over a week feeling like his own story still belonged to him. It was a different message entirely that stopped him cold that same night. Buried among the hundreds still pouring into his inbox, not a producer, not a network, just a private message from an account with no profile picture, the name simply reading J. Alvarez. "I heard what you said today at the hearing. I wanted to thank you. I never told anyone what those boys did to me because I didn't think anyone would believe an old janitor over 3 rich kids. Watching you stand up the way you did gave me the courage to finally tell my own story too. You didn't just help yourself, you helped a lot of people who never had the chance to be heard the way you were." Mason read the message 3 times, his throat tightening with each pass before showing it to his mother. Laura pressed a hand over her mouth, tears rising instantly. "You see what you started." "I didn't start anything," Mason said quietly. "I just stopped staying quiet." "Sometimes that's the exact same thing," Laura said. The following week brought its own strange rhythm of aftermath, reporters occasionally recognizing Mason on campus, classmates who had once looked away, now going out of their way to greet him. The particular disorientation of moving through a world that had fundamentally shifted its posture toward him without his identity actually changing at all. He was still the same person who had once eaten lunch alone rather than risk another cruel comment. He was still the same person whose hip ached on cold mornings and whose hands still occasionally trembled, remembering the sound of carbon fibers snapping under someone's boot. But the world around him had recalibrated its response to who that person was, and adjusting to that recalibration took its own kind of work. Victor checked in nearly every day, sometimes with a phone call, sometimes showing up unannounced with doc or preacher in tow, gradually folding himself into the rhythm of the Carter household in a way that felt less like an intervention and more like something settling permanently into place. One evening over dinner at the small kitchen table, Victor brought up something he'd clearly been turning over in his mind for a while. "I've been talking to Doc and Preacher about the fund," he said. "The one we started for your medical costs and equipment. We want to expand it into something bigger, a proper nonprofit dedicated to helping disabled students afford the equipment and support they need, named for Danny." Mason set down his fork. "Danny, your brother. Figure it's about time his name meant something other than grief," Victor said, his voice rough. "The Daniel Hayes Foundation. We've already got donations coming in from 3 states more every day since the story spread. Doc thinks by next year we could be funding equipment for a couple hundred students, not just here in Nevada, but wherever the need turns up." "That's incredible," Laura said softly. "Wouldn't be possible without what happened to your son," Victor said. "I want you both to know that. This isn't charity flowing one direction. Mason gave something back just as valuable as anything we gave him. He gave Danny's name a second chance to mean something good in the world." Mason felt his throat tighten again, the particular ache of being handed a piece of someone else's grief and finding it fit somehow into the shape of his own healing. "I'd like to help," Mason said. "Not just be the reason it exists, actually help build it. I'm studying engineering. I could work on affordable equipment designs, adaptive tech that doesn't cost 2 years of overtime shifts to afford." Victor studied him for a long moment, something proud and unguarded moving across his weathered face. "Danny would have liked you a whole lot." "I would have liked to know him," Mason said quietly. Across town, in a house with a circular driveway that had recently seen far fewer visitors than usual, Richard Briggs sat alone in his study, scrolling through a different kind of news. Entirely a steady stream of 1-star reviews accumulating across all 3 of his dealership locations. Customers citing the video, the hearing, the story that had, despite every attempt at damage control, refused to disappear. His phone buzzed, a text from his business partner. "We need to talk. Sales are down 11% this month. People are canceling service appointments. I don't know how much longer we can absorb this." Richard set the phone down and pressed both palms against his eyes, the particular exhaustion of a man realizing far too late that some things simply could not be bought back once they'd been lost. He thought briefly and bitterly of the check he'd offered Laura Carter that first afternoon, a fraction of what this was now costing him, and he'd been too arrogant to understand that some debts could never be settled with money, only with the kind of accountability he'd spent his entire adult life avoiding. 2 days later, a statement appeared on the Briggs Motors Company website, carefully worded by a crisis management consultant Richard had reluctantly hired, offering a formal apology for his son's conduct and announcing a partnership with the newly forming Daniel Hayes Foundation, a partial pledge of dealership proceeds toward adaptive vehicle modifications for disabled drivers. Victor read the announcement with a skeptical eye when Preacher forwarded it to him. "You believe this is genuine?" Preacher asked. "Doesn't matter if it's genuine," Victor said after a long moment. "Money spent helping disabled folks afford adaptive vehicles helps them whether the man writing the check learned his lesson or just learned what happens to a business that doesn't apologize fast enough." He shrugged. "We'll take the partnership. We'll watch him closely, and we'll let the actual results speak louder than whatever's in his heart." Mason, when told about the announcement, felt a complicated tangle of emotions he didn't fully expect. Not quite forgiveness, not quite satisfaction. Something more like the recognition that consequences, even imperfect ones, still mattered. "Do you think he's actually sorry?" Mason asked Victor. "I think he's sorry it cost him something," Victor said honestly. "Whether that ever turns into being sorry for what it actually was, that's between him and whatever conscience he's got left. Not our job to sort that out. Our job's just making sure something good comes out of it regardless." That weekend, Whitmore Community College held a small, unofficial gathering near the parking lot where everything had begun. Not organized by the administration, but by students themselves, word spreading through group chats and hallway conversations, until nearly 200 people showed up, carrying handwritten signs and quiet, genuine gratitude. Mason stood near the same stretch of cracked sidewalk where he'd once sat alone with his broken crutches, now surrounded by classmates who had learned in the space of one impossible week exactly what it cost to look away and exactly what it meant to finally stop. Priya Malhotra approached him, her earlier nervousness from the hearing replaced by something steadier. "I wanted to say thank you again. Speaking up at that hearing was the hardest thing I've ever done, but watching you do it first made it possible." You didn't need me to make it possible, Mason said. You just needed someone to go first. Maybe, Priya said, but I'm glad it was you. Emily found him a few minutes later, Renee trailing a step behind her, both of them beaming. The school's forming a student disability advocacy council, Emily said. They asked if I'd help start it. I said yes before I even thought about it. That's amazing, Mason said, genuinely moved. I wanted to ask, Emily added a little shyly, if you'd want to be involved too, not as like the face of the tragedy or whatever, just as somebody who actually understands what needs fixing. Mason considered it, feeling the solid weight of his new crutches beneath his palms, thinking about Priya's courage and Mr. Alvarez's quiet years of silence, and the janitor's message glowing on his phone screen the night the hearing ended. Yeah, he said, I'd like that. A slow, uneven gait caught his attention near the edge of the gathering, and Mason turned to find an older man making his way through the crowd, a maintenance uniform still on beneath an open jacket, clearly having come straight from his shift. It took Mason a moment to place him, though he recognized the limp before he recognized the face. Mr. Alvarez? The older man stopped a few feet away, suddenly looking uncertain, like he wasn't sure he had the right to intrude. I hope it's all right that I came. I saw the crowd from the maintenance building, and I wanted to see you in person. Say thank you properly instead of just through a message. Of course it's all right. Mason closed the distance between them, extending a hand, which Mr. Alvarez shook with both of his grip trembling slightly. I didn't know about what they did to you. I wish I had. Wasn't your job to know, Mr. Alvarez said. Was my job to say something, and I didn't for years. Told myself it wasn't worth the trouble. Told myself a janitor complaining about some rich kids wouldn't go anywhere good. He shook his head slowly. Watching you stand up in that hearing, refusing to let it just disappear quietly, that undid something in me I didn't know was still tied up so tight. You're not alone anymore, Mason said. Neither of us are. Mr. Alvarez's eyes filled, and he nodded, unable to speak for a moment, before finally managing a small, grateful smile. Dean Voss called me yesterday, asked if I'd want to help with that new policy they're building. Said my experience mattered. He shook his head again, wonderingly. 30 years I've worked this campus. Nobody's ever asked what I thought mattered before. Well, Mason said, get used to it. I don't think that's going to stop now. Victor watched the small gathering from a short distance away, arms crossed, a rare, unguarded smile settling into the lines of his weathered face as he took in the scene, the same parking lot that had once held nothing but silence and cruelty, now filled with something entirely different, something he'd spent 6 years hoping to see again after losing the chance to give it to Danny. Doc joined him, following his gaze. You did good, old man. We did good, Victor corrected. Wasn't just me. No, Doc agreed. But it started with you stopping that bike 2 days ago instead of riding past like everybody else did. She nudged his shoulder. Danny would be proud of you too, you know, not just of Mason. Victor didn't answer right away, his throat working around something too large for words. Watching Mason laugh at something Emily said, watching Laura wipe happy tears from her cheeks nearby, watching a campus slowly learn what it looked like to actually show up for each other instead of simply watching from a safe distance. 6 years I carried that regret, Victor finally said. 6 years wondering if I could have done something different for Danny if I just paid closer attention. I don't think that regret ever fully goes away, but it feels lighter today than it has in a long time. That's what showing up does, Doc said. Doesn't erase what you missed, just make sure you don't miss it again. Mason caught Victor's eye across the small crowd and lifted one crutch slightly in a kind of salute, a private acknowledgement between the two of them that needed no words to carry its full weight. Victor lifted his hand in return, and for a moment, standing in that same parking lot where everything had once gone so terribly wrong, it felt to both of them like something had finally completely been set right. The story that had begun with 4 broken words, they broke my crutches, had become something neither of them had expected when it started. Not just a rescue, not just a reckoning, a beginning quietly taking root in a college parking lot, spreading outward into a foundation bearing a dead man's name, into a policy that would protect students who hadn't even enrolled yet, into the courage of a janitor who finally felt safe enough to speak. Mason understood now, standing there with his mother's hand in his and Victor's steady presence a few feet away, that strength had never been about the moment he sat broken on wet pavement, waiting for someone to notice. It had been about everything that came after the choosing, again and again, not to disappear. 8 months later, Mason Carter stood at the front of a small conference room at the Daniel Hayes Foundation's new office space, a converted auto shop 2 blocks from Victor's garage, presenting a prototype to a room full of people who had once been strangers and were now in every way that mattered family. The current design cuts material costs by almost 40%, Mason said, turning the carbon fiber forearm crutch over in his hands, angling it so the room could see the adjustable grip mechanism he'd spent the better part of a semester designing in his spare hours between classes. Same durability as the premium models, same custom angle adjustment. But instead of costing $1,200–1,300, we can produce these for under $400, which means the foundation can fund almost triple the number of students with the same donation base. Doc leaned forward in her chair, turning the sample crutch over with a practiced eye, testing the weld points, flexing the shaft slightly to check the give. "This is good work," she said, finally looking up at him with something like wonder. "Really good work, Mason." "I had a good reason to get it right," Mason said quietly. Near the back corner of the room, half hidden behind a stack of shipping boxes, Connor Wells looked up from where he'd been sorting inventory, a foundation volunteer badge clipped to his shirt. He'd finished his restorative justice placement back in the spring, and rather than disappearing quietly back into ordinary campus life, the way most people expected, he'd asked Grace for a letter of introduction to Victor, showing up at the garage every Saturday since without anyone asking him to. "You want me to start prepping the shipping labels for the batch order?" Connor asked. "Yeah, that'd help a lot," Mason said, and something easy passed between them, now worn smooth over months of working the same cluttered garage floor, the awkward weight of what Connor had once done to him, gradually replaced by the steadier fact of who he'd chosen to become since. Victor sat near the back of the room, arms crossed the way he always sat, watching Mason present, with the particular pride of a man who had shown up for a broken 20-year-old on a wet sidewalk and lived to watch him become someone who built solutions instead of just surviving problems. The last 8 months had moved faster than Mason expected, each week layering onto the last, in ways that sometimes made it hard to remember exactly who he'd been before that autumn afternoon outside the science building. He was still Mason Carter, still the same quiet, stubborn kid who had spent years refusing to let a highway accident define him. But something fundamental had shifted underneath that foundation, some deep architecture of belief that had finally permanently rearranged itself. He no longer believed the world would look away. That belief had been tested plenty in the months since small moments of doubt, days when the weight of being publicly known as the Crutches kid felt heavier than he wanted to carry, nights when old insecurities crept back in, uninvited. But every single time something or someone had shown up to remind him the shift was real, not just a temporary high from one extraordinary morning. Like now standing in a converted garage that used to just repair motorcycles and now also build affordable mobility equipment for kids who couldn't otherwise afford it. "We've got our first full batch order coming through next week," Doc said, setting the prototype down carefully. 12 students across 3 states, first ones getting equipment built off Mason's redesign. "You want to be there when the first pair ships out." "Wouldn't miss it," Mason said. After the meeting broke up, Victor caught him near the door, a manila folder tucked under one arm. "Got something for you," he said, holding it out. "Foundation's annual report, first full year of numbers." Mason took the folder and flipped it open, scanning the figures inside, his breath catching slightly at the scale of what had grown from a single broken pair of crutches and 145 motorcycles. 211 students funded across 6 states, $43,000 in redesigned equipment costs saved through Mason's engineering work alone, partnerships with 4 community colleges to formalize disability advocacy councils modeled after Whitmore's, a pilot program launching next semester to train student volunteers in basic equipment maintenance, so kids wouldn't have to wait weeks for a simple repair the way Mason once had. "This is incredible," Mason said, his voice thick. "I didn't realize it had grown this much already." "Neither did I, honestly," Victor admitted. "Started as me trying to make one bad afternoon right for one kid. Didn't expect it to turn into this." "Danny would be proud," Mason said quietly, watching something move across Victor's face at the sound of his brother's name, softer now than it used to be, the grief worn smooth at the edges like river stone instead of jagged like it had been 8 months earlier. "He'd probably tease me for taking this long to figure it out." Victor said, a small, rough laugh escaping him. "He always did have a mouth on him. Never let me get away with anything easy. Sounds like he'd have liked me, Mason said, echoing something Victor had told him months before. He would have loved you, Victor said. Would have given you endless grief about the engineering stuff, though. Thought anybody who liked math that much needed to get out more. Mason laughed, the sound easy and unguarded, in a way it rarely had been a year ago before any of this began. That evening, Mason drove himself to his mother's apartment, a small used sedan. The foundation had helped Laura finance 6 months earlier, modified with hand controls that meant Mason could drive independently for the first time since the accident that had changed his leg 8 years before. Another quiet victory nobody outside the family fully understood the weight of. Laura met him at the door, flour dusting her apron, the smell of something baking drifting out into the hallway. "You're just in time," she said, pulling him into a hug. "I'm making the caramel cake, the one for Saturday." Saturday, Mason repeated, and then remembered his stomach doing a small, nervous flip. "The anniversary ride." "The anniversary ride," Laura confirmed, studying his face. "You nervous?" "A little," Mason admitted, settling onto a kitchen stool while his mother returned to the stove. "It's strange thinking about going back to that exact spot, standing there again a whole year later. Strange good or strange bad?" Mason considered the question seriously, turning it over the way he'd learned to do with most things that used to just make him flinch and look away. "Strange good," he decided finally. "I think I need to see it, not as something that happened to me anymore, as something I walked all the way through." Laura's eyes went soft and a little wet, the way they still did sometimes when the weight of the last year caught up with her unexpectedly. "You've done more than walk through it," she said. "You've built something out of it. Not everybody manages that." "I had help," Mason said. "A lot of it." "You did," Laura agreed. "But you're the one who kept getting back up long enough to receive it. That part's always going to be yours." Laura had her own version of that same reckoning, though she rarely spoke about it unprompted. The Foundation's board had offered her a part-time coordinator position back in the spring, overseeing family support services for newly funded students, a role that used her years of patient care experience without the brutal physical toll of double shifts at the assisted living facility. She'd hesitated for nearly a month before accepting, some old instinct telling her that easier things were somehow less deserved, until Victor had finally sat her down and told her plainly that surviving on empty for years wasn't a badge of honor, just an unnecessary cost she no longer had to pay. "I still pick up a shift or two most weeks," she told Mason once, half apologetically, like she needed to justify not fully letting go. "Old habits. You don't owe anybody exhaustion, Mom," Mason had told her, echoing words Victor had once told him. "Not even yourself." Not every part of the story resolved as cleanly. Dylan Hart had transferred to a college 2 states away that spring, and the last Mason heard secondhand through a mutual acquaintance was that he'd been asked to leave a fraternity there after a similar pattern of behavior surfaced, mocking a pledge with a stutter for the entertainment of his new friends. Mason felt no satisfaction hearing it, only a quiet, sober understanding that not every story bent toward growth just because the world offered the chance. Tyler had chosen to become someone different. Connor had chosen it, too slower and messier, but genuine. Dylan so far had chosen to stay exactly who he'd always been, and Mason had learned over the past year that he couldn't carry responsibility for outcomes that were never his to control in the first place. The following Saturday arrived cold and clear, an early autumn morning, almost identical in temperature and color to the one exactly a year before, when Mason had sat broken on wet concrete and nobody around him had moved. This time, when the low rumble of engines began building somewhere across town, Mason wasn't caught off guard by the sound. My turn. He was standing in the same parking lot at Whitmore Community College, waiting for his new crutches, the redesigned version, now lighter than even the ones Doc had built him a year earlier, resting easily beneath his palms. Emily stood beside him now, the official head of the college's Disability Advocacy Council, along with Priya, who had transferred her major to social work after everything that happened, determined to build a career around exactly the kind of advocacy she'd once been too afraid to offer. "You ready?" Emily asked, glancing at him. "Ready enough," Mason said, though his heart was pounding in a way that felt different from a year ago, not fear this time, but something closer to anticipation. The sound grew the same way it had grown a year earlier, filling the air until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then the first motorcycle rounded the corner onto the street bordering campus, followed by another, then a dozen, then more than Mason could easily count. 138 riders this year. Preacher would later confirm slightly fewer than the original 145, a handful, unable to make the return trip, but joined by new faces too, people who had heard the story in the years since and wanted to be part of whatever came next. Preacher found Mason not long after the formation settled, pulling up a folding chair beside him with a folder of his own, clearly eager to share something. "You hear about Ohio?" Preacher asked. "What about Ohio, Peso?" "Chapter out there heard about what we did here, decided to do their own version for a kid getting bullied over a stutter, same as that boy who testified at your hearing. 40 riders showed up outside his middle school last month." Preacher shook his head, something like wonder in his weathered face. Then a chapter in Texas did something similar for an elderly woman getting evicted illegally by a slumlord. Then Oregon. It's spreading Mason. Not because anybody organized it, just because people saw what showing up looked like and decided they wanted to do their own version of it. Mason sat with that for a moment, the scale of it settling slowly into place. "I never thought about it going beyond here, beyond this campus. That's usually how the real ones work," Preacher said. "Never announced in advance, just spreads because it's true, and true things have a way of finding the people who need to hear them." Victor led the formation again, pulling off his helmet as he swung down from his bike, the same unhurried certainty in his stride as he crossed toward Mason. "1 year," Victor said, stopping in front of him, something reflective moving across his weathered face. "1 year," Mason agreed. "Feels like it should feel longer, or shorter. I can't decide which." "Both, probably," Victor said. "That's usually how the big ones work." Behind him, riders began dismounting. Familiar faces spreading out across the same lot, Doc setting up a folding table out of habit, even though nobody needed emergency equipment delivered this time. Tank waving from across the crowd. Sandra and Cole and Marcus and a dozen others. Mason had come to know over the past year, no longer strangers who'd shown up once for a cause, but something closer to an extended, unconventional family that had simply kept showing up. Sandra found him near the edge of the crowd, her handshake turning into a brief, warm hug. "I finally did it," she said. "Filed the formal complaint against that nursing home about how they treated my mother before she passed. Took me a year to work up the nerve, but watching what happened here gave me the push I needed. They lost their state license last month." "I'm so glad," Mason said, meaning it fully. "Wouldn't have happened without this place," Sandra said, gesturing at the gathering around them. "Sometimes it just takes watching somebody else go first." Marcus approached a few minutes later, quieter as always, though something in his posture seemed lighter than it had been the year before. "Started volunteering with the VA," he said without much preamble. "Mentoring guys coming back with new limitations, helping them navigate the benefits system, mostly just being somebody who's already walked the road they're starting on." He shrugged, almost embarrassed by the admission. "Figured if nobody showed up for me the way we showed up for you, the least I could do was become that for somebody else." "That's exactly it," Mason said. "That's the whole thing, isn't it? Just passing it forward." "Seems to be," Marcus said, a small smile finally breaking through his usual quiet. "Turns out it's contagious once it gets started." A cluster of students who hadn't been there the year before watched with open curiosity, some of them having only heard the story secondhand through campus legend and viral video clips that had long since faded from most feeds, but never fully disappeared from Whitmore's collective memory. "Is that really him?" Mason overheard one freshman whisper to another. "The crutches guy from the video." "That's him," the other student confirmed. "He's like actually really nice, not weird about it or anything." Mason smiled slightly, no longer stung by being reduced to the crutches guy the way he might have been a year earlier. It was simply part of his story now, not the whole of it, and he'd made peace with the parts of himself that would always carry some version of that identity forward. Dean Voss approached partway through the gathering, older-looking. Somehow, despite it only being a year, the particular fatigue of someone who had spent 12 months rebuilding institutional trust, one careful decision at a time. The new reporting policy's been fully implemented across all 3 campuses in the district, she told Mason, pride evident in her voice. "We've had 11 formal complaints filed and properly investigated this year that would have gone unreported under the old system. 11 students who got help faster because of what happened here." "That's incredible," Mason said. "Really incredible." "It's because of you," Dean Voss said. "I want you to hear that clearly, Mason. Not because of the bikers, not because of the video, because you refuse to let your own experience disappear quietly even when it would have been so much easier to just accept the settlement and move on. Mason thought about that for a moment, the same complicated tangle of feelings from the disciplinary hearing, resurfacing briefly, not quite pride, not quite discomfort, something more like the recognition of a weight he hadn't fully asked to carry, but had chosen to anyway. I just didn't want anybody else to sit alone on that sidewalk, he said finally. If that's what it did, then it was worth it. A familiar, uneven gait approached from the direction of the maintenance building, and Mason turned to find Mr. Alvarez making his way toward the gathering, no longer in his old maintenance uniform, but in a modest suit, a lanyard around his neck, identifying him as a consultant with the college's Disability Services Office. "Mr. Alvarez," Mason called out, genuine warmth flooding through him. "You look sharp. Feel a little ridiculous in this get-up, honestly," Alvarez said, tugging self-consciously at his collar, though his grin gave away how pleased he actually was. "Dean Voss has had me sitting in on policy meetings all year and reviewing every new complaint that comes through, making sure it gets handled the way it should have been handled for me all those years ago." "How does that feel?" Mason asked. Alvarez considered the question seriously. "Feels like the first time in 30 years anybody's asked what I actually think matters. Feels good. Feels overdue." He looked around at the gathered crowd, at the motorcycles filling the lot, at the students mingling with the riders, like old friends instead of strangers who'd once frightened them on sight. "Feels like the world's a little bit more the way it should have been all along." Near the edge of the crowd, a tall, familiar figure hung back slightly, uncertain whether he belonged there, and Mason spotted him before anyone else did. Tyler Briggs stood near the science building, thinner than Mason remembered, dressed simply, watching the gathering with an expression that mixed longing and shame in equal measure. He hadn't been invited exactly, but the event was public, held in an open parking lot, and something had apparently pulled him back to the place where his old life had ended and something else still unclear had begun. Mason excused himself from the conversation and made his way over, aware of a few curious glances following him. Tyler startled slightly, clearly not expecting to be approached. "Mason, I just wanted to see it. From a distance, I wasn't trying to intrude." "You're not intruding," Mason said. "What have you been doing since the expulsion?" Tyler was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding how honest to be. "Working at a rehabilitation center in Sparks. Nothing glamorous. Transport basic maintenance, helping with intake paperwork." He shrugged, a self-deprecating half-smile crossing his face. "Started as court-ordered community service, after my dad's lawyers finally stopped fighting everything, and I just accepted whatever consequences came. Figured I'd hate it. Figured I'd count down the days. And I didn't hate it," Dulles admitted. I don't know. I actually think I'm good at it. There's a kid there, maybe 9 years old. Cerebral palsy reminds me a little of what your friend Victor said about his brother. I help him with his exercises 3 times a week. He calls me his favorite, which feels like something I definitely didn't earn given everything." His voice caught slightly. "I'm applying to a physical therapy assistant program in the spring. Feels strange. Wanting to spend my life around exactly the kind of people I used to think were funny to mock." Mason studied him for a long moment, feeling none of the anger that once would have accompanied this conversation, only a quiet, complicated recognition of a person genuinely trying to become someone different. "That's not strange," Mason said finally. "That's exactly what Victor told you to do that day in the parking lot. Spend the discomfort becoming somebody who wouldn't do it again." "I think about that a lot," Tyler said. "What he said, what you said actually in the hearing." He met Mason's eyes directly for the first time. "I don't expect forgiveness. I never will. But I wanted you to know it actually changed something, not just my transcript, something underneath that." "I believe you," Mason said, and found somewhat to his own surprise that he genuinely did. Tyler nodded, something loosening slightly in his posture, like he'd been carrying the uncertainty of that conversation for months and was only now setting a piece of it down. "I should go. I don't want to make things weird for anybody." "You're not making it weird," Mason said. "But if you ever want to actually be part of what's happening here instead of watching from a distance, the Foundation's always looking for people who understand what it costs to get it wrong and choose different anyway." Tyler blinked clearly, not expecting the offer. "You'd want me around that?" "I'd want you around the version of you that's spending 3 afternoons a week helping a 9-year-old with cerebral palsy," Mason said. "That guy sounds all right. He didn't wait for a response, turning back toward the gathering, but he caught out of the corner of his eye something that looked almost like hope crossing Tyler's face before he turned and walked away. Not quite ready yet, but perhaps someday. Near the folding tables, a commotion of a different kind was building. DACA unveiling something new this year. A banner strung between two poles announcing the Foundation's next major initiative, a partnership with 3 additional states to replicate the equipment redesign program Mason had spearheaded. But it was a smaller, quieter moment that caught Mason's attention more than the banner. A young girl, maybe 7 years old, stood near her father's motorcycle, a bright pink prosthetic leg visible beneath her shorts, staring up at the crowd of riders with open wonder. "That's Tank's daughter," Victor said, appearing at Mason's side. "Mia, first time she's come to one of these." Mason watched as Tank knelt down beside his daughter, pointing toward the folding table where a small box sat waiting, one of the redesigned pediatric mobility aids Mason had helped develop over the past few months, sized specifically for children her age. "That's one of mine," Mason said quietly, something warm and unfamiliar spreading through his chest. "The pediatric line. First batch just went out this month." "You want to go say hello?" Victor asked. Mason crossed the lot, slowly kneeling down carefully beside Tank and his daughter, meeting Mia at her eye level. "Hi," he said. "I hear you might need one of these." Mia studied him with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a young child glancing between his face and his crutches. "Do you have a fake leg too?" "No," Mason said gently. "My leg got hurt a long time ago, so I use these instead. But I helped build the thing your dad's about to show you." Mia's eyes widened. "You built it?" "With some really smart friends," Mason said. "We wanted to make sure kids like you had something built exactly right for you instead of something that was just close enough." Tank watched this exchange with something thick in his throat, glancing up at Mason with quiet, overwhelming gratitude. "She's been asking for weeks if the new one would finally fit right. Her old one's been pinching for months, and we couldn't afford to replace it until the fund came through." "It'll fit right," Mason promised. "I made sure of that myself." Mia reached out unprompted and wrapped her small arms around Mason's neck in a brief, fierce hug before darting off toward the folding table to inspect her new equipment, leaving Mason kneeling there for a moment, blinking hard against the sudden sting behind his eyes. Victor extended a hand to help him back up. "You all right?" "Yeah," Mason said, his voice rough. "Just that's the first time I've actually met one of the kids we're helping. Face to face. It's different than seeing the numbers in a report." "Gets you right here, doesn't it?" Victor said, tapping his own chest. "Every time, probably," Mason said. "I hope it never stops." Across the lot, a final unexpected arrival drew a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. Richard Briggs stepped out of a modest sedan, no longer the Mercedes. Mason noted a small detail that seemed to carry more weight than it should have and made his way slowly toward the gathering. His posture nothing like the rigid authority of a year earlier. Laura spotted him first stiffening slightly, an old instinct rising before she consciously willed it back down. Richard stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes finding Mason across the crowd. "I won't stay long," he said when Mason approached, his voice quieter than Mason remembered, stripped of the practiced smoothness that had once made his threat sound almost reasonable. "I just wanted to say something in person, something I should have said a year ago instead of what I actually did." Mason waited, saying nothing, letting the moment hold its own weight. "I'm sorry," Richard said simply. "Not sorry it cost me business. Not sorry the lawyers couldn't fix it. Sorry for what I actually did, offering your mother money to disappear, then threatening her when she wouldn't. I was so focused on protecting my son's future that I never once stopped to think about what protecting looks like when it's built on making somebody else's pain disappear instead of actually fixing it." "What changed?" Mason asked, genuinely curious. "Watching Tyler," Richard admitted. "Watching him actually become somebody different this year. Somebody I don't fully recognize, sometimes in the best possible way. It made me realize the version of fatherhood I thought I was protecting him with, smoothing everything over, buying away consequences, that was never actually protecting him at all. It was just delaying the reckoning he needed to become who he's becoming now." Mason considered him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his voice against the memory of that cold, threatening phone call to his mother. "I don't need you to apologize to me," Mason said finally. "I need you to keep the partnership genuine. Keep funding the adaptive vehicle modifications. Keep showing up even after the cameras and the headlines are long gone. That's the only apology that actually means anything a year from now." I intend to, Richard said. For what it's worth, sales recovered about 4 months ago once people saw we were actually following through instead of just making a statement to save face. Turns out doing the right thing, even reluctantly, even for the wrong reasons at first, tends to work out better than the alternative. He didn't stay long after that, offering Laura a brief, awkward nod that she returned with careful civility, rather than warmth, before returning to his sedan and driving away, leaving behind a silence that felt for the first time entirely resolved rather than merely paused. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the crowd began to thin the way it had a year before, riders slowly remounting their bikes' engines, starting up in scattered gentle waves rather than the thunderous unified roar of the original arrival. Victor found Mason near the edge of the lot, both of them watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the science building, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that felt to Mason entirely different from the gray, overcast morning exactly a year earlier. "You did good today," Victor said, standing up in front of everybody, talking to Tyler, meeting that little girl. "I didn't do anything today that I haven't been doing it all year," Mason said. "Just showing up, same as you taught me." "That's the whole trick," Victor said. "Nobody ever tells you it's that simple because it sounds too small to matter. But it's the only thing that ever actually does." Mason looked out at the parking lot at the last few riders saying their goodbyes, at his mother laughing with Doc near the folding table at Emily and Priya, already deep in conversation with Mr. Alvarez about next year's advocacy council goals. "Can I ask you something?" Mason said. "Always. Do you think Danny would recognize any of this if he could see it?" Victor was quiet for a long moment, watching the last rays of sun catch the chrome of the departing motorcycles. "I think Danny would recognize exactly this," he said finally. "Not the foundation, not the numbers in some annual report. Then make it anything. Go on. He gestured at the thinning crowd at Mason, standing solid on his own 2 feet, with his crutches at his sides rather than beneath him, for the moment at the quiet, ordinary miracle of people simply choosing again and again to show up for each other. This is what he always deserved and never quite got enough of. I think he'd be glad somebody finally built it, even if it took losing him to teach me how." Mason didn't have words adequate to that, so he simply reached out and clasped Victor's shoulder the way Victor so often did to him, letting the gesture carry what speech couldn't. Victor covered Mason's hand with his own for a moment, weathered and solid, before finally pulling back and reaching for his helmet. "I'll see you Thursday," he said. "Foundation board meeting. Don't be late this time." "I'm never late," Mason protested. "You were 15 minutes late in March." That was one time. Victor's laugh followed him all the way to his bike, warm and easy, and Mason watched him ride out of the lot alongside the last of the departing riders. The sound of engines fading slowly into the ordinary evening quiet of a campus that had, over the course of one impossible year, learned exactly what it looked like to become the kind of place that showed up for its own. Before joining his mother at the car, Mason lingered a moment longer near the science building, thinking about the graduation still 2 years off, about the job offers he had already started fielding from adaptive equipment manufacturers who'd read about his redesign work, about a future that had once felt narrow and uncertain, and now stretched out ahead of him wide enough to hold whatever he decided to build inside it. He wasn't sure yet exactly what shape his career would take, whether he'd stay with the foundation full-time, or split his work between there and a larger manufacturer, or chase something else entirely that hadn't occurred to him yet. But for the first time in years, the uncertainty didn't frighten him. It felt instead like room to grow into. Mason stood there a long while after everyone else had gone, his mother waiting patiently by the car, giving him whatever time he needed with the space that had once held nothing but his worst memory, and now held something entirely reconstructed in its place. When he finally settled into the passenger seat beside her, Laura didn't start the engine right away, just sat there for a moment, studying his face in the fading light. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," Mason said, and found that he meant it completely without the careful hedging he might have added a year earlier. "Better than okay, actually." "It's a lot, isn't it?" Laura said, standing there again, watching all of it laid out at once, everything that grew out of one terrible afternoon. "It is," Mason agreed, "but it's the good kind of a lot. I keep waiting for it to feel like too much the way it did at the start, and it just doesn't anymore. It just feels like my life now. Like this is who I actually am, not some story that happened to me." Laura reached over and squeezed his hand once before finally starting the car. "That's because it is who you are. It always was underneath everything. The world just finally caught up to seeing it." He thought about the boy who had sat here a year ago, broken crutches in his hands, asking for help that never came from the 50 strangers surrounding him. He thought about the 4 words that had changed everything. They broke my crutches, and how strange it was that something so small, spoken in a moment of complete despair, had somehow become the foundation for everything that followed. He thought about Priya finding her courage, about Mr. Alvarez finally being heard after 30 years of silence, about Tyler slowly rebuilding himself into someone unrecognizable from the boy who had once laughed while destroying another person's dignity, about Mia's small, fierce hug, and the pediatric crutches that would let her run alongside other children without pinching or pain. About 211 students across 6 states who now had equipment they could actually afford because one man had refused to ride past a broken 20-year-old on a wet October afternoon. None of it erased what had happened. The 3 months of cruelty, the 90 seconds of silence while a crowd watched and did nothing. The ache that still sometimes surfaced in quiet moments, phantom and unwelcome, reminding him what it had cost to get here. But it had built something on top of that pain, sturdy enough to hold real weight, the way scar tissue sometimes grows back stronger than what it replaces. Mason understood now, standing in that parking lot with the sun setting behind him and his mother waiting with the patient, unwavering love that had carried them both through the worst of it, exactly what strength had actually meant this entire time. It was never about the moment he fell. Everyone falls. Everyone eventually sits somewhere on some version of that cold, wet pavement, waiting for someone, anyone to notice they're struggling. Strength was what happened after. It was Mason forcing himself back to campus the very next morning on borrowed crutches that hurt his wrists, refusing to let humiliation win by disappearing. It was Laura working double shifts and still finding the strength to fight a threat from a man with more money and more lawyers than she could ever match. It was 145 strangers deciding that somebody else's pain was worth interrupting their own lives to address. It was Priya finally speaking after months of silence, and Mr. Alvarez finding his voice after 30 years, and even Tyler, flawed and undeserving of easy forgiveness, choosing every single day to become someone different than the boy who once thought cruelty was funny. Strength was choosing again and again not to disappear. Mason Carter had not simply survived the worst afternoon of his life. He had transformed it, turned 4 broken words and a pair of shattered crutches into a foundation that reached across 6 states, into a policy that protected students who would never know his name, into the quiet, permanent knowledge that no matter how dark a moment became, somebody somewhere would always be willing to stop. He looked out at the empty parking lot one final time, at the space where his old life had ended and his new one had truly begun, and felt something settle inside him with the weight and permanence of a promise finally completely kept. He was not invisible. He had never been invisible. He had simply been waiting for the world to catch up to what he'd always known was true about his own worth. And when it finally did, it arrived not quietly, but roaring in on 145 motorcycles, loud enough to be heard for the rest of his life. Mason Carter turned steady on his own 2 feet and walked toward his mother, toward the car, toward whatever came next, no longer wondering if anyone would notice him, because he now understood completely and permanently that he never had to wonder that again. Some stories end where the pain stops. This one ended somewhere far better than that. It ended exactly where every act of genuine kindness eventually leads not to an ending at all, but to a beginning that kept multiplying outward, one person, one crutch, one act of courage at a time, proving beyond any possible doubt that the world was still and would always be full of people willing to stop.